Chapter 261. The frost in the early morning of spring was very thick. Both sides of the street were covered with white, and it would not fade until the sun rose. In the room where Su Li lived in the affiliated school of the National Academy, the charcoal crackled, and wisps of heat rose from the holes of the heater, making the room as warm as spring. Su Li wore a thin coat and reclined on the soft couch by the window. A pair of clear eyes stared at the old booklet in her hand. She was extremely fascinated. When the first ray of morning light came in through the window, Su Li squinted her beautiful eyes and put down the booklet in her hand. I didn't expect that after breaking the ring, my understanding has been improved so much. In just 2 days, I have comprehended the 4th hurdle of AO sword skills, and I am not far from the 5th hurdle. She couldn't think of the disadvantages of breaking the ring, and the consciousness in my Ruahan's mind would not tell her. So, it was useless to think about how to use the foundation after breaking the ring. She had made some discoveries after studying these days. The speed of practice had become faster, and it was not just a little bit faster. If she wanted, she could break through to the longevity realm in another month. Her current state was more suitable to say conversion than to practice. Converting the foundation into cultivation was certainly faster than absorbing the spiritual power from the outside world. Of course, the more and faster she practiced, the closer she would be to death. If she couldn't grasp this point well, it would be useless to have a higher cultivation. The second point was the improvement of the understanding. Su Li's eyes flickered slightly. She had obtained AO sword skills from Jin Cheng AO for a long time, but she always lingered in the 4th hurdle and couldn't enter the 5th hurdle. Although she had some achievements in swordsmanship in the previous life, her talent was still not good enough to comprehend such a wonderful book as AO sword skills. But these defects disappeared after the ring was broken. It seemed that her innate understanding was so enchanting and beyond the cognition. Fortunately, I comprehend AO sword skills based on my understanding and didn't consume the foundation. Otherwise, no matter how much foundation I have, I can't stand the consumption. Su Li sighed softly. If a warrior only had the strength of genuine energy without the means to fight against the enemy, he was simply a waste. A Xiantian second-stage martial artist who only knew how to practice, if he were to encounter a Xiantian first-stage martial artist who had gone through hundreds of battles, then he might not even be able to last one move. Cultivation was one aspect, and martial techniques were another. Only by possessing both could one become an expert of the same level. My cultivation is now stuck at the peak of the inborn realm. I don't know how much foundation will be consumed to break through to the longevity realm. Now it's not the right time, and I don't have to rush to break through. It's better to spend all my time on martial arts. With my terrifying comprehension, I may be able to compete with the longevity realm. While Su Li was thinking, Mammy Li's joyful voice came from outside the door. "Young miss, the young master is here." "Young master?" Su Li was stunned, and then the indifference on her face became gentle. "Is it my eldest brother?" "That's right. Young Master Qingtan just came back last night and came this morning." Mammy Li's voice came again. A smile appeared on Su Li's face. "Let eldest brother wait for a while. I will change my clothes now." "Sigh." Mammy Li responded and quickly went to reply. Soon after, Su Li changed her clothes and came to the front room. Then she saw Mammy Li and Su Qingtan chatting casually. "Mammy, if you didn't take the risk to find me 2 years ago, I wouldn't know that my second sister had suffered so much. Now the bitterness is over and the happiness is coming. What the young master said is right." Su Qingtan sighed with emotion. Su Li's origin did not affect his love for Su Li, which began to sprout a long time ago. Now that he knew that Su Li was not related to him by blood, he didn't know what his feelings for Su Li were. "Eldest brother," a clear and melodious voice suddenly came, which was as sweet as clear spring water. Su Qingtan's heart skipped a beat. He turned his head and saw Su Li in plain white clothes walking towards him. Her temperament was more ethereal than before, and her skirt was fluttering like a fairy descending to the world. Su Qingtan was stunned for a while. He hadn't seen his second sister for more than half a year. Although her beautiful face was covered by the secret skill of nothing unusual, it was still intoxicating. "Eldest brother, what are you looking at?" The voice was getting closer. Su Qingtan came to his sense and smiled bitterly. Second sister, with your appearance now, I'm afraid that many people will come to propose marriage to you. Su Li squinted her eyes and chuckled. Eldest brother, what are you talking about? No one comes and no one dares to come. Hearing this, Su Qingtan was stunned again. In his impression, his second sister would never say such overbearing words. She became confident and calm. She was no longer a weak girl who had to ask for his opinion. If he compared Su Li to a frightened deer in the past, now she became an elegant white swan, noble and cool. Thinking of Su Li's current identity, Su Qingtan's expression was slightly stiff. He forced a smile and said, Second sister, you seem to have changed a lot in the past half a year. People always change. Su Li pretended to sigh and immediately hugged Su Qingtan's arm. She said seriously, but no matter how I change, you are my eldest brother. Su Qingtan was slightly stunned. He was stunned for a moment, but a silly smile appeared on his face. He nodded heavily. I will always be your eldest brother. At the same time, the strangeness in Su Qingtan's heart faded away. At the same time, he felt a little ashamed. For a moment, he thought that Su Li would alienate him because of her identity. Sure enough, he thought too much. No matter how his second sister's temperament changed, as long as she didn't change in front of him, it was enough. After thinking it through, Su Qingtan opened his mind and played with Su Li for a day. He didn't leave until the evening. Ling Qinglan only gave him 1 day to rest, and he spent all his time on Su Li, eldest brother. Be careful on the way. Su Qingtan's carriage drove away from the affiliated school of the National Academy. Su Li's gentle and cordial expression faded away. She returned to the room. Fang Yuan, who was hiding behind the screen, appeared in a flash. He frowned and said, Su Qingtan got involved in the Enmore cult. Shall we get him out? With the Hongyang house as an intelligence agent, the Linli building knew the situation in Yunjing City like the palm of its hand. Although everything was calm now, the Enmore cult would eventually attack the royal family. If Su Qingtan got involved, he would definitely be in danger. Su Li's eyes were slightly gloomy. All kinds of thoughts flashed through her eyes. Then she shook her head and said, No. Qiu Shengong is the secret of the Enmore cult. Eldest brother has practiced it, so he is the core figure of the Enmore cult. Even if Ling Li is willing to let him go, the elders of the Enmore cult will not agree. It turns out that there is such a secret. Fang Yuan's heart sank and he stopped talking. Compared with Su Li, his vision was still too narrow. Su Li worried about many things at this time, but Su Qingtan was not. The current situation was stable. With the help of Ling Qinglan, Su Qingtan was now an inborn senior. His temperament and life-saving ability had been greatly improved. It was not so easy for him to be killed. What she cared about most at the moment was the Wanjian sect. Since the auction house, the people of the Wanjian sect had disappeared. When Tingshan came back from the Qinghe province, it was unreasonable that there was no movement for such a long time. There were only 2 possibilities in this situation. The first possibility was that the people of the Wanjian sect had left and stopped chasing Wen Tingshan. But for the position of the head of the Wanjian sect, they would not easily give up. Then there was only the second possibility. They were delayed by something. Maybe someone was facing a breakthrough, or maybe they were facing greater interests. There are few forces in Yunjing City who can help to cover their tracks so well. Su Li's eyes flashed. She said, Help me to make an appointment with Ling Li as Mr. Li. The time is tomorrow. See him. Fang Yuan was slightly shocked and his face became pale. He couldn't help but ask, Why do you want to see him? Su Li turned around. Her clear eyes seemed to be able to see through people's hearts, which made Fang Yuan inexplicably frightened. Fang Yuan wanted to explain, but he was interrupted by Su Li's cold voice. The Wanjian sect is a great threat. If we can't find him, the Linli building will not be peaceful. The Enmore cult and the Wanjian sect used to have a bad relationship in the spiritual circle. It is a win-win situation to cooperate with the Enmore cult. Speaking of this, Su Li's eyes were complicated, and her expression was still cold. She said, Because of my affairs, the Linli building should also respond. This is the best time for me to get rid of the relationship with Mr. Li. Fang Yuan frowned when he heard it, and then he stretched his eyebrows. There was an obscure surprise on his cold face. Although he still didn't know what Su Li wanted to do after hearing these words, it was the first time that Su Li explained the purpose of the action to him, so he was naturally happy. Soon after, Fang Yuan left in the night. Su Li looked at the dim night sky and stood in the cold wind for a moment. Then she returned to the room and continued to study the AO sword skills. Soon, the news of the Linli building came to the Ling mansion. Li's affairs happened 7 days ago, and the Linli building responded. Did Mr. Li make an appointment? Ling Li received the news and frowned deeply. This matter was full of strangeness. It was too strange. If Mr. Li intended to stand up for Su Li, he should not be so slow. But if he didn't have a deep relationship with Su Li, he should not get involved in this kind of thing, so as to avoid trouble. Ling Qinglan, who came to deliver the news, also looked dignified. He said in a deep voice, "Before, we had always been in a cooperative relationship with the Linli building. We even established a preliminary friendship with the Linli building because of the full moon and heartstrings incident. Now we rely on the Linli building for a lot of elixirs and poisons. If Mr. Li cuts off the supply, our actions are bound to be affected." Ling Li closed his eyes and rubbed his eyebrows. Then he opened his eyes again, and his eyes were shining. "Tomorrow, I will be well prepared. No matter what Mr. Li does, I will take it." Chapter 262. On the lake, on the ship. It was still the place where they met last time. The difference was that Fang Yuan, who disguised himself, stood beside Su Li. At this moment, he was standing outside the ship house, side by side with Ling Mo. In the ship house, Ling Li looked at the young man in cyan who was natural on the side of the chessboard. He was slightly shocked and then chuckled. He broke the silence first. "Mr. Li, you invited me here. You don't just want to play chess, do you?" Su Li's long and narrow eyes flashed a hint of obscure complexity. She picked up a chess piece with her fingertips and said absent-mindedly, "Of course not. Hierarch Ling, you are busy. How dare I disturb you?" Ling Li frowned slightly and tapped on the side of the chessboard with his fingers. He raised his eyebrows and said, "Mr. Li, just say it. I haven't seen you for a long time. Hierarch Ling, you seem to be more irritable." Su Li judged slowly, and her smile gradually became cold. "Hierarch Ling, I think you can guess the purpose of my coming here today. Please give me an explanation for the attack on me by the higher-ups of your cult a few days ago." Ling Li breathed slightly and his expression changed. Sure enough, he came to seek justice for her. Su Li was his woman, but now it was a strange man's turn to seek justice for her. How ironic was it? He looked slightly pale and said coldly, "Su Li once said that you don't have a deep relationship with her. I will deal with it myself. It seems that it is not your turn to intervene as an outsider, right? Hierarch Ling, you are wrong." Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly and pinched her fingertips between her knees. She pretended to be relaxed and said, "Hierarch Ling, you don't know. If you killed Su Li, although I have some cooperation with her, I won't stand up for her. But Su Yu, who you killed, is a member of the Linli building." Hearing this, Ling Li's expression changed instantly. Su Li's aunt turned out to be a member of the Linli building. Su Yu is at the peak of the inborn realm. She is a great fighting force of the Linli building. Not only that, her husband is also a member of me, and he is a senior in the inborn 8th hurdle. After Su Yu's death, her husband also disappeared. You made the Linli building lose 2 fighters of the inborn realm. How should we settle this account? Su Li's words shocked Ling Li and made him completely speechless. In this way, after Li's aunt died, her uncle also left her. Would she be wronged? Ling Li gently spat out a mouthful of turbid air. He nodded and lowered his eyes. A touch of pain emerged. If he had noticed Ling Xian's abnormality earlier, all this would not have happened. It was the result of his negligence. No matter how Su Li blamed and hated him, it was not an exaggeration. At the moment when he raised his head, Ling Li's expression had returned to normal. He said slowly, Our Enmore cult admits it. What compensation do you want? A trace of surprise flashed between Su Li's eyebrows. Ling Li had always been hostile to her identity. There would be some twists and turns today. She didn't expect that he would be so easy to talk to. Sect Master is truly a straightforward person. This matter is related to the face of the Linley building. If we don't make some compensation, we will be regarded as weak. My request is not much, only two. First, I originally wanted sect leader to hand over the murderer, but after my investigation, I found that there was no need to hand over the murderer. Compensate the Linley building with 100 Wudao stones. As soon as the words came out, the third elder standing behind Ling Li immediately frowned. 100 Wudao stones were too much. The value of the full moon and heartstrings auctioned in Yunjing City was no more than 10 Wudao stones. Mr. Li asked for 100 Wudao stones. It was an exorbitant demand. Sure enough, Ling Li couldn't help but frown when he heard this. 100 Wudao stones are too much. Even if our Enmore cult takes out so many at once, the foundation will be shaken. I can only give you 50 at most. This is the limit that I can decide. Su Li's eyes flashed and she gently nodded. I don't know the wealth of your spiritual circle. So, 50 is okay. Seeing that Su Li agreed, Ling Li secretly breathed a sigh of relief, but he had doubts in his heart. Your spiritual circle. Was Mr. Li not a person of the spiritual circle? Were there other cultivation circles besides the spiritual circle? The details of this person were a mystery, and it had been impossible to find out. But what he said might be a deliberate decoy, so he couldn't be easily believed. Thinking of this, Ling Li got rid of distracting thoughts and continued to say, "What's the second request?" Su Li raised the corner of her mouth and smiled mysteriously. The second request is not so much a request, but I want to cooperate with you again. Cooperation? Ling Li was puzzled. Now the Enmore cult and the Linley building had no common interests. What else could they cooperate with? I remember that your Enmore cult has always been at odds with the Wanjian sect in the spiritual circle, right? Su Li said bluntly with her eyes shining. The relationship between the Enmore cult and the Wanjian sect was told by Ling Li himself, and then confirmed by Wen Tingshan. Now it became a tool in her hands to decoy. Ling Li's body shook slightly, and he said meaningfully, Mr. Li is really resourceful. You even know the news of the spiritual circle clearly. Su Li chuckled and said indifferently, it was not a secret in the spiritual circle decades ago. It is not difficult for me to know it. And I also know that a group of people of the Wanjian sect has been staying in Yunjing City in recent months. But they are good at hiding, so they haven't left any traces. It seems that the cooperation you are going to propose has something to do with the Wanjian sect. Ling Li's tone was full of doubts, but he was more sure. Su Li nodded and said, to be honest, the Linley building and the Wanjian sect also have some grievances. I will not be at peace if I don't find out those rats. Why don't you and I cooperate to investigate and find them out as soon as possible? Such cooperation is what the Enmore cult is looking forward to. But, Ling Li's eyes flickered, what do you want to do after finding out the people of the Wanjian sect? Su Li didn't hesitate and replied with a smile, it's good if we can catch them alive. But if we can't catch them, we can only kill them. Ling Li took a deep look at Su Li, who was smiling. After thinking for a moment, he nodded and said, such cooperation is what the Enmore cult is looking forward to. Later, I will send Qinghu to contact the Linley building and share intelligence. That's good. Since it's settled, I won't stay here any longer. Goodbye. Su Li stood up and smiled with her hands folded. Then she turned around and left without any hesitation. Ling Li frowned when he saw Su Li leave. He thought that Mr. Li came to denounce him, but when they met, the so-called apology was just a formality. He was afraid that even if he reduced the number of Wudao stones to 10, Mr. Li would also agree. The real purpose was for the Wanjian sect. Hierarch, since Mr. Li is also hostile to the Wanjian sect, maybe we can cooperate with him to kill our way to the spiritual circle. The third elder's voice suddenly sounded, and his eyes were full of light. Mr. Li is extremely not simple. Even I feel a faint sense of danger when facing him. If there is no accident, his cultivation must reach the level of the longevity realm. The longevity realm can only be broken through in the spiritual circle, and he is also inextricably linked with the spiritual circle. Ling Li thought quickly, but then he shook his head and said slowly, "It's hard to say everything based on this person's words. The Wanjian sect has been in chaos in recent years. Now a small group of people inexplicably appeared in Yunjing City, and the Linli building hurried to deal with them. It's hard to say the relationship between them and the Wanjian sect." The third elder's face changed slightly. "You mean," Ling Li waved his hand to stop the third elder from continuing, "it's just my guess. We have to find the people of the Wanjian sect to decide the specific situation. Hierarch is wise." The third elder bowed his head and complimented. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Although his cultivation was at the peak, he was still far behind the hierarch in terms of quick thinking. With Ling Qinglan's help, the Enmore cult couldn't restore its prosperity in the past. Old ancestor has found the right successor. The third elder thought of Su Li again. Now he knew that Su Li, who was almost killed by Ling Xian that day, was the masked woman in the Tang mansion. At that time, he thought that the woman was just an ordinary person. Later, when they met in the alley, he knew that Su Li was good at hiding. Her cultivation was not inferior to that of the hierarch. She was decisive in killing and quick in thinking. If such an amazing woman married the hierarch, it would be a good story. Unfortunately, the third elder shook his head and sighed. It was too late to say anything now. The Enmore cult and the Linli building, the two secret forces in Yunjing City, joined hands. Yunjing City seemed to be peaceful, but in fact, it was turbulent. Spies of the two forces were everywhere. They searched for the whereabouts of the people of the Wanjian sect inch by inch. Even Su Qingtan also participated in it. He was responsible for the exploration of a small area. Ling Qinglan was very busy, not only because of the Enmore cult, but also because of the trifles of the supreme judiciary. He was busy until late at night every day. On the one hand, he couldn't stand Mrs. Gu's repeated persuasion. On the other hand, for the sake of the Enmore cult, he now lived in the Ling mansion and didn't care about the third prince deliberately. After the auction house, the first prince and the third prince almost lost favor at the same time. They were put under house arrest by Dongfang Xiao and couldn't go out. Now the fifth prince was the most prestigious one in the royal family. That night, Ling Qinglan finished his business and returned to the Ling mansion alone. The night was as cold as water. The cold street under the moonlight looked bright. Ling Qinglan's shadow was long. He walked around the last corner and saw the gate of the Ling mansion. The lanterns on both sides of the gate had not been extinguished yet. Ling Qinglan felt warm and smiled. He knew that Aunt Chiu Meng specially left the lanterns for him. At this moment, crack. Chapter 263. In the dim night, a beautiful woman in plain white clothes came into Ling Qinglan's eyes. She looked a little nervous and her eyes were extremely bright. She was looking at him with a very strange look. Ling Qinglan raised his eyebrows and walked to her. He said softly, "It's late at night. It's not peaceful in Yunjing City. What are you doing here alone?" Then, the beautiful woman didn't answer. She just looked at him blankly. It seemed that she was stunned. Ling Qinglan felt more and more strange. He looked at her carefully and his expression changed slightly. He recognized her. Wasn't she the former top girl of the Hongyang house, Chu Lu? Usually, Chu Lu was seductive with heavy makeup in the brothel. But now she changed her face. He almost didn't recognize her. However, after the auction fair, the woman's identity had been exposed. She was the Xiangzhu of the Hehuan sect. Why did she suddenly appear here tonight? Thinking of this, Ling Qinglan smiled and tentatively said, "Why do you come here so late at night?" Chu Lu was slightly shocked. But when she thought of the warning of the Linli building, her heart sank slightly. She took a deep breath and said nervously, "Emo. You." Ling Qinglan's expression changed dramatically. He knocked Chu Lu out and took her to the east courtyard of the Ling mansion. After a breeze, there were two more people in the east courtyard. Ling Mo saw Ling Qinglan holding a woman. He couldn't help but feel strange. Ling Li also frowned and asked. Don't get me wrong. This woman actually knows my real identity, so I brought her back. Ling Qinglan explained and put Chulu down. There was a trace of doubt in his heart. This woman clearly had the cultivation of the acquired ninth hurdle. If she wanted to escape from him, although it was not troublesome, it would take some effort. But just now, the woman didn't struggle at all, as if she knew that he wouldn't hurt her. Could it be, is she an old friend? Ling Qinglan's eyes changed. He stared at Chulu's face, but he couldn't find any connection between her and him. You can interrogate this person. Since she can recognize you, maybe she knows more detailed information about the destruction of the Yi family. Ling Li said lightly. He stood up and said, I have to prepare the Wudao stone. This study is for you temporarily. Ling Mo, let's go. Ling Li left the study without saying anything. Ling Qinglan was stunned for a moment. He shook his head and laughed. After Su Li's affair, Ling Li was more decisive than before. Cough, cough. Chu Lu, who was lying on the rattan chair, coughed and opened her eyes blankly. She saw that she was in the same room with Ling Qinglan and there was no one else. She was relieved and looked at Ling Qinglan's face with a trace of nostalgia and fascination. Ling Qinglan snorted uncomfortably and said indifferently, Miss, there are only you and me here. You don't have to play dumb. Tell me, who told you my real name? Chu Lu trembled and was surprised. But when she heard Ling Qinglan's question, tears appeared in her eyes. She murmured, Mo, you are really Mo. Do you remember you have an elder sister? Sister. When Ling Qinglan heard this, he was shocked, but he was still unmoved on the surface. He shouted coldly, Nonsense. I'm the only son in the Yi family. How can I have an elder sister? If you still talk nonsense, don't blame me for being merciless and torturing you. Hearing Ling Qinglan's cold words, Chu Lu was completely panicked. Was it because the tragedy of that year had such a great impact on him that he completely forgot her? No, Mo, how could he forget me? I am your sister Shui. Chu Lu couldn't believe it. She couldn't help but step forward and hug Ling Qinglan's back. Her tears were like broken beads. She said, Did you forget the agreement by the lake on that snowy night? As soon as she finished her words, Chu Lu felt that her shoulders were suddenly pinched. She looked up blankly and found that Ling Qinglan had turned around and looked at her with surprise. His cold expression had long melted and was as soft as spring water. Sister Shui, it's really you. Chu Lu stared at Ling Qinglan blankly. After a long time, she finally burst into laughter. She wiped her tears and said with grievance, Little brother, I haven't seen you for so many years. You even want to test your elder sister. Ling Qinglan was ashamed and said, I don't want to. But now the situation in Yunjing City is unclear. I can only do this. Only you and I know the agreement between you and me. Even if you are not Sister Shui, you must be someone very close to her. So, I can feel relieved to recognize you. Chu Lu touched her face and sighed softly, There is a reason why I look like this. No wonder you don't dare to recognize me. Sister Shui, why do you have a relationship with the people of the Hehuan sect? Ling Qinglan frowned and couldn't help but ask. Chu Lu stared at Ling Qinglan, who was already good-looking. She immediately smiled slightly. She told him everything about her experience in the Hehuan sect. As for her encounter with Mr. Li, she didn't mention anything. Damn it. The old witch Yi Tian is so vicious. She learned the secret skill to kill others and treat you like this. I'm going to get even with her. Ling Qinglan's eyes were red and he was furious. He couldn't wait to rush to the nest of the Hehuan sect and kill Yi Tian. Chu Lu quickly held Ling Qinglan and comforted him. Don't. Although the Enmore cult is powerful, the Hehuan sect is also a big sect. If you rashly kill the Hehuan sect, you will expose yourself and give the royal family a chance. Besides, the Hongchen powder in my body has been detoxified. I have escaped from the Hongyang house. In the future, the people of the Hehuan sect will not find me. The gentle voice of his sister was like the murmur of a brook. It soothed Ling Qinglan's violent mood. He took a deep breath and calmed down. His eyes flashed with wisdom. Sister Shui, it is said that the Hongchen powder is incurable. How did you get rid of the control of the Hehuan sect? Ling Qinglan was puzzled. Although he no longer doubted Chu Lu's identity, how could his sister suddenly escape after being trapped in the Hehuan sect for 9 years with her ability? Hearing that, Chu Lu was slightly shocked. She unconsciously thought of Su Li's order. Although the Linli building cooperates with the Enmore cult, we have some unpleasantness recently. Our relationship is not the same as before. If you dare to reveal any information about the Linli building, don't blame me for being ruthless. Mr. Li had always been mysterious. If he was ruthless, what would he do? Chu Lu thought of the first time she met Su Li. Every time she made a move secretly and every time she probed, she was defeated. She couldn't help but shudder. Such a person was usually kind. But if she violated the agreement, the Mr. Li would be ruthless. The consequences would be unimaginable. Sister Shui, what are you thinking? Why are you sweating? Ling Qinglan took out a handkerchief and wiped the sweat for Chu Lu. Chu Lu came back to herself with fear. She forced a smile and whispered, Xiaomo, although I want to tell you everything, I have an agreement with the person who saved me. I can't reveal any information about him. I can only tell you that I seized the opportunity at the auction at the end of last year and successfully escaped from the site of the Hehuan sect. Then we can meet. Ling Qinglan frowned. Chu Lu's words were very straightforward. It was not appropriate for him to continue to ask. The mysterious person who helped him secretly could find out his real identity and the identity of the Enmore cult. It was extremely difficult. Sister Shui, you are tired. Let me help you to have a rest. I will arrange your identity well. They left the study and came to the courtyard where Ling Qinglan lived. Chu Lu smiled slightly and reached out to smooth Ling Qinglan's eyebrows. She said softly, You don't have to worry about me. I have endured for 9 years. Now I will be more careful when I meet you. The senior taught me the secret skill of disguise. I will disguise myself and follow you. Then, Chu Lu didn't say anything more. She turned around and walked into the room. Ling Qinglan's heart sank. Who was helping Sister Shui? The person even taught her the secret skill of disguise, which was rare in the martial arts circle. After thinking for a moment, Ling Qinglan subconsciously thought of a person. Could it be him? Ling Qinglan slightly pursed his lips. His life was saved by him. Now, if his sister came back because of him, he really didn't know how to repay such a great kindness. Even if he could detoxify the Hongchen powder, he must pay a big price. After thinking about it, Ling Qinglan shook his head and sighed. Everything was his guess. Since Sister Shui didn't want to say it, he couldn't force her. It was lucky that she came back safely. There was no need to get to the bottom of it. After the disturbance of Chu Lu, a few days later, Su Li received a message from Fang Yuan every day. She was more and more awestruck. She had cooperated with the Enmore cult. The two forces worked together to find the Wanjian sect, but they didn't find any trace. It's impossible. Unless, the Wanjian sect has cooperated with the local forces in Yunjing City and hidden a place that we can't find. Fang Yuan analyzed in a low voice. Obviously, he also noticed the abnormality. If so, don't waste your effort. Su Li's eyes flashed. She thought for a moment and suddenly said, You go to contact someone. What? Fang Yuan was stunned and raised his head in surprise. Did Su Li have a backup plan in the dark? On the second day, Fang Yuan, who disguised himself, sat on the second floor of an unknown tea house. He slowly drank tea and silently counted the time. After a while, a man in bamboo hat suddenly sat down in front of him. Without saying anything, he picked up the wine and drank it. Then he tapped the table with his fingers. Hearty. Fang Yuan smiled and replied, It's to drink together. The man in bamboo hat immediately lowered his head and whispered, Protector Fang, I pay my respects. Is there anything unusual in the royal family? Fang Yuan came straight to the point. Obviously, he trusted the man in bamboo hat very much. If he lifted the bamboo hat, he would find that the man was Dongfang He, who was captured at the auction that day. Several months later, the effect of the secret skill on Dongfang He didn't weaken, but became more powerful. He was completely loyal to Su Li and even had more members to inquire for information for Su Li. All the shameful information in the Shisan Institute of the Imperial Palace was passed to Su Li through Dongfang He. Hearing Fang Yuan's question, Dongfang He immediately told him in detail what happened recently. Chapter 264. At noon, it was the busiest time in Yunjing City. The Linli building was bustling with customers and the business was much better than before. "Sir, please come in. Sir, what would you like to order today?" Yin Shuetong and Mai Ruahan were busy collecting money and keeping accounts at the table. Suddenly, the light at the door dimmed. They looked at the door at the same time and were shocked when they saw the man's dress. Fang Yuan? Fang Yuan didn't disguise himself. How could he come in from the front door? What happened? Yin Shuetong felt something was wrong and immediately called Chu Qingning. "Hey, sir, please come in." Chu Qingning pretended to be enthusiastic and took Fang Yuan, who looked gloomy, directly upstairs. Others didn't find anything strange. In the room, Chu Qingning poured a cup of tea for Fang Yuan and couldn't help asking, "Didn't you go to see the spy of the royal family? Why did you come in from the front door and look so gloomy? Is there any clue about the Wanjian sect?" Fang Yuan took a breath and calmed down for a moment. He said, "There is no news about the Wanjian sect, but Dongfang He sent another important news. Dongfang Xiao is going to bestow a marriage." Chu Qingning was confused and repeated subconsciously, "Bestow a marriage? To whom?" He was stunned for a moment and looked at Fang Yuan's gloomy face. Suddenly, his expression changed slightly and he was terrified. "Is it?" Chu Qingning stared at Fang Yuan and found that Fang Yuan tacitly agreed with his guess. He couldn't help but be shocked and paced around hurriedly. How could it be? "I'm going to find Su Li." After a while, Su Li came to the Linli building after receiving the urgent tip-off. After listening to Fang Yuan's low voice, she slightly raised her eyebrows and said calmly, "You mean that Dongfang Xiao will bestow a marriage to me?" "Yes." Fang Yuan couldn't hide his anxiety and concern in his eyes. He quickly explained, "According to Dongfang He, Dongfang Xiao wants you to marry Ma Jintian for the benefit of the Dongfang family. The imperial edict is being drawn up. I'm afraid that there will be news in a few days. Ma Jintian doesn't deserve you. Dongfang Xiao has no right to decide who you will marry." In the end, Fang Yuan was furious, and his cold face was slightly red. Su Li was always as calm as water, and there was no change on her face. Her eyes flickered slightly, and she said lightly, "It's not as simple as you think. Dongfang Xiao was scheming. If he suddenly attacked, he must have something to ask for. I need to think about it carefully before making a decision." Su Li, Fang Yuan still wanted to say something, but Su Li suddenly turned around and said coldly, "Your mind is in a mess. You'd better go to have a rest first." Fang Yuan was slightly shocked, as if he was poured a bucket of cold water on his head. His red eyes became clear, and he immediately looked at Su Li with more complicated eyes. "Why? It's clearly related to your life's happiness, but you're not anxious at all. Have you never thought about your life from beginning to end? Never considered, me, you, take care to rest?" All kinds of thoughts came to his mouth, but became a meaningless concern. Fang Yuan sighed and turned to leave the attic. Su Li, who was meditating, didn't look back. Naturally, she did not see how lonely his back was. The room was quiet. Su Li touched her wrist, and her expression was slightly cold. At this time, if she was given more time to master enough force, she would not be so passive. Unfortunately, God always seemed to be against her. Dongfang Xiao suddenly attacked. There were many coincidences, but there must be inevitability in accidents. The power in my father's hands can actually make that old guy afraid. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly. Although the private troops in Dongfang Rui's hands were excellent, they were not many. They were far inferior to the royal guards. What Dongfang Xiao feared was the sudden appearance of the Yunj guards. Was it because he didn't know the layout of the Yunj guards that the old guy feared and then tested? Thinking of this, Su Li took a light breath. She could imagine how furious Dongfang Rui would be after the imperial edict was issued. If he was pushed to the extreme, he might only have one way to go, raising troops to rebel. But once it developed into that situation, Dongfang Xiao would directly use the imperial power to eradicate Dongfang Rui. She would never allow such an ending to happen. The Ma family has always been the most loyal lackey of the Dongfang family. So, Dongfang Xiao chose Ma Jintian. If I marry into the Ma family, my father can only listen to Dongfang Xiao for fear of harming the innocent. Dongfang Xiao's soldiers can defeat all obstacles for his son without bloodshed. Su Li thought quickly. As a person who had lived 2 lives, she knew the situation of Yunjing City better than anyone else. But just because of this, she knew that no matter Lord Rui's mansion, the Linli building or the Enmore cult, she couldn't act rashly. In the previous life, the Enmore cult developed longer and was more powerful, but it was destroyed eventually. If she didn't figure out the reason, she couldn't do anything. So, how can I solve this situation? Su Li stood attentively. She began to think about the solution. She couldn't marry into the Ma family and let Dongfang Xiao succeed. If Ma Jintian died, this idea just came up, but it was immediately rejected by Su Li. It didn't matter if Ma Jintian died. He was not the only choice. There were many young talents in Yunjing City. Dongfang Xiao could be replaced by Wu Jin or any other family that was not a threat to Dongfang Xiao. She couldn't kill all the young talents in Yunjing City. If I can't kill him, there is only one way. Su Li's clear eyes flashed a vague light. No one knew what decision she would make tonight. After a while, Su Li left the Linli building alone. When Fang Yuan wanted to follow her, it was too late. He even couldn't see her. It was a quiet night. The next day, it was quite peaceful. There was no news from the imperial palace. Fang Yuan waited anxiously for half a day. Finally, he received Su Li's order. He opened the note, and his expression immediately eased. He smiled slightly. Without saying anything, he went out with his servants to do something. In the streets of Yunjing City, a rumor gradually spread. It became more and more fierce under the promotion of some people. It was said like it was true. Have you heard? The child of Prime Minister Ma, that is Master Ma. He is impotent. Ah. Really? Of course. I heard from the girls in the brothel that Master Ma was overindulged in debauchery. His lower body was impotent. Tut-tut. These childs really don't know how to control themselves. Ma Jintian is not 18 years old yet, right? Yes. At the beginning, only 1 or 2 people talked about it. Later, it became a secret that everyone in Yunjing City knew. The more it spread, the more unbelievable it became. Some people said that Ma Jintian had sex with more than 10 girls in one night. That was why he got sick. Some people even said that they saw Ma Jintian lose his temper with their own eyes. The rumor was true. In just one day, almost everyone knew that Ma Jintian was impotent. It was a hot topic in Yunjing City. At this moment, Ma Jintian listened to his father's scolding in the Ma mansion. He was confused. Dad, don't you know my temperament? I am not a playboy like Ling Li. How can I go out to fool around? Ma Jintian's face was red. He was so angry that he roared, "It is even more impossible that he is impotent. Which bastard slandered me like this?" In Mada's eyes, Zhongtai's reaction was a little angry out of humiliation. He stared at his son and asked seriously, "Jintian, is what you said true?" Seeing that his father still doubted him, Ma Jintian was so angry that he was about to die. He nodded helplessly and said, "It's true. Dad, every word I said is true. It is truer than gold." "Well, you don't need to say anything. I believe you." Mada waved his hand and said, "You can leave now. I will help you to deal with it." "Yes, Dad." Ma Jintian had no choice but to leave. When he turned around, he looked ferocious. He almost gnashed his teeth. He really wanted to tear the bastard who spread the rumor into pieces. It was a great shame for him to do that. "Bastard, don't let me catch you." Ma Jintian scolded him with hatred. Then he flung his sleeves and left with a long face. Seeing his son leave, Mada's expression instantly turned gloomy, and his heart began to pound. How could it be so coincidental? The imperial palace was about to issue the imperial edict, but Jintian had such a thing. If the emperor misunderstood the loyalty of the Ma family, it would be bad. Mada asked Ma Jintian several times, but he didn't reveal any flaws even though he was furious. Either Ma Jintian didn't know and was set up, or he didn't want to marry Su Li. Thinking of this, Ma sighed deeply and sat down with the help of the table. No matter which possibility it was, the status of the Ma family in Dongfang Xiao's heart would be lowered. Butler, prepare the sedan chair to go to the imperial palace. Ma put on his official uniform and went out in a hurry. Even if it was not Ma Jintian who bestowed the marriage, he had to be polite. Otherwise, the Ma family would be in danger because of Dongfang Xiao's suspicion. At this moment, in the imperial study in the imperial palace, Dongfang Xiao paced and suddenly smiled. So, now the whole city is full of the rumor about the boy of the Ma family. The imperial edict that I carefully prepared is useless. Eunuch Feng, who was bowing and standing aside, slightly changed his expression. He immediately knelt down and said respectfully, "Your Majesty, please calm down. It may be a coincidence." Coincidence? Dongfang Xiao sneered and said, "I really hope that it is a coincidence, otherwise." Eunuch Feng was slightly shocked. He quickly bowed his head and kowtowed, "Your Majesty, I am loyal and devoted. I didn't tell anyone except Lord Ma, who already knows that you are going to bestow the marriage. If it was you who leaked the secret, do you think you can still talk to me here?" Eunuch Feng trembled slightly and didn't dare to say anything more. Useless thing. Dongfang Xiao cursed and turned around with a gloomy face. But at this moment, a eunuch passed a message from outside the study. "Your Majesty, Lord Ma asks to see you." Speaking of the devil has arrived. What a coincidence, hey. Chapter 265. After a while, Ma De, who was outside the imperial study, received the notice. He immediately stepped into the door and hurried in. When he turned around, he saw Eunuch Feng kneeling on the ground. He couldn't help but feel shocked. He quickly bowed and knelt beside Eunuch Feng. "Your Majesty. Long live your Majesty." Dongfang Xiao slightly opened his eyes and looked at Ma De, who was kneeling on the ground for a moment. He suddenly said softly, "Long live your Majesty. I think you can't wait for me to die of anger now." Hearing this, Ma De was shocked. He raised his head and said excitedly, "Your Majesty, why do you say that? This old official is loyal to your Majesty and the heavens can prove it. I am willing to sacrifice my life for your Majesty and die for you. Your Majesty, if you don't believe me, That's enough." Dongfang Xiao waved his hand impatiently to stop Ma De's show. He asked calmly, "Tell me, what's going on with your son?" Ma De wiped his cold sweat and thought that he finally got over the difficulty. He thought of Ma Jintian's reaction and couldn't help but frown. "I can guarantee with my life that only I know that your Majesty wants to grant a marriage. You didn't tell my son. Now Yunjing City is full of gossip because of my son. Someone must be deliberately playing tricks." Deliberately playing tricks? Dongfang Xiao thought for a while and then shook his head slightly. No matter how the news is leaked, the person has achieved his goal. Since the boy can't marry my niece, you two tell me which boy is a good match for my niece. This, Eunuch Feng was thinking. Although Ma De was disappointed, he didn't dare to show his emotion. He tried his best to solve the problem for Dongfang Xiao. After a while, Eunuch Feng said first, "Your Majesty, how about the first child of the Minister of the Ministry of Rights? He is handsome." Before Eunuch Feng finished his words, he was interrupted by Dongfang Xiao impatiently and scolded, "Idiot. The Minister of the Ministry of Rights is 24 years old and has 3 wives. Su Li is my niece and the princess of the Dahan country. Do you want me to be reviled for thousands of years by letting her marry him?" Eunuch Feng trembled and kept kowtowing, "I dare not." Dongfang Xiao stood up and turned around. He flicked Eunuch Feng's face with his sleeves and said, "Listen carefully. I'm choosing a husband for the princess of the Dahan country. How can it be a joke? If he couldn't find a family of equal status, wouldn't he be a joke to others? Our imperial family can't afford to lose this face. If you can't think of anyone, then kneel until you think of someone," Dongfang Xiao said and left the imperial study. Hearing the footsteps getting farther and farther, Ma De and Eunuch Feng looked at each other and sighed. They both saw the fear and helplessness in each other's eyes. Obviously, Dongfang Xiao vented his anger on them because of Ma Jintian. Eunuch Feng, do you know why His Majesty suddenly decreed a marriage? Marder could not help but ask after everyone in the imperial study had left. There are many young talents in Yunjing City. If your Majesty really wants to grant a marriage to the little princess, there are many people who are well matched. Eunuch Feng reminded Marder in a low voice. Then he looked around and said in a lower voice, His Majesty must have a very special purpose. We should figure it out carefully. Marder's heart trembled slightly. He thought of many things in an instant, but how could he dare to say such a disgraceful thing? If this was just His Majesty's test of him, and he really acted too smart, perhaps His Majesty's next target would be him. Marder wiped the fine sweat on his forehead and showed a trace of embarrassment in his slightly turbid eyes. Eunuch Feng knelt beside Marder calmly and didn't continue to remind Marder. His words were explicit enough. He knew His Majesty's mind very well, but he couldn't live a better life if he didn't know. He deliberately mentioned the son of the Minister of the Ministry of Rights just to protect himself. This time he knelt here because of Marder. His Majesty really wanted to ask Marder, not him. If he said a suitable candidate, His Majesty would be more unhappy. In the quiet imperial study, Marder's heavy breathing became more and more harsh. Sweat gathered on the ground under his forehead. It could be seen that his mind was fluctuating violently. Lord Ma. Suddenly, a vague sound came into Ma Jintian's ears. Ma Jintian was slightly shocked. When he was about to speak, the voice came again. Don't make it public. I just can't bear to see His Majesty continue to kneel, so I come to remind him. His Majesty just needs to listen and don't say. Marder was surprised. He didn't expose the voice. Although he suspected that the owner of the voice was the one who leaked the information, he didn't have the confidence to deal with the aftermath well. Besides, he really needed this person's reminder to get through the difficulties. As for whether he was used or not, it had to wait until he successfully got rid of Dongfang Xiao's suspicion. The person His Majesty wants to find must meet 3 requirements. 3 requirements? Marder was shocked. There were actually 3 requirements. First, the person must be well matched in social status. The person whom His Majesty wants to marry must be someone that all the civil and military officials in the imperial court can't find any flaws. At least, his status is not lower than that of His Majesty. Second, the person's family is either like Lord Ma, who completely works for the Dongfang family, or he is just a paper tiger with a status but no real power. It is easier for His Majesty to deal with him. Third, the person must be someone that His Majesty doesn't like. It is better to make His Majesty resist, and then let 8th Lord. In this way, Lord Ma, do you understand? Hearing this, Marder was suddenly enlightened, and then he was shocked. Sure enough. His Majesty couldn't help but fight with 8th Lord. In order to deal with 8th Lord, His Majesty made such a detour. It was really hard to guess the Emperor's heart. However, who was the person who reminded him just now? He could understand His Majesty's thoughts and transmit the sound in the palace. Was it possible that he was not the initiator of the information leak, but a member of the Dongfang family? Did His Majesty send him to remind me? Marder was confused, but he also knew that he could only bury this doubt in his heart, so as not to cause trouble for himself. Anyway, after the mysterious person reminded me, I have a suitable candidate. Marder thought. He didn't need to investigate the news about Su Li. Everything that happened around the first beauty in Yunjing City would be spread by people. For example, the school of the affiliated school that caused a stir a few months ago. Thinking of this, Marder smiled confidently and said to Eunuch Feng, who was kneeling beside him, Eunuch Feng, you are really tired this time. I have already thought of a suitable candidate. Eunuch Feng was a little surprised and amazed. After a short time, Marder thought of a perfect plan. It seemed that Marder's mind was much more powerful than he thought. Soon, Eunuch Feng invited Dongfang Xiao. Eunuch Feng told me that you have already thought of a suitable candidate. Tell me. Dongfang Xiao waved his sleeves and sat down. He looked dignified and looked at Marder, who was humble and respectful. Your Majesty. Marder got up and bowed to salute. I think the 3rd child of the Ling General's mansion is the most suitable candidate. Oh. Dongfang Xiao was surprised and his tone became gentle. Why do you say so? Ma De knew that there was a chance and quickly said, in terms of background, the third child of the Ling family, Ling Li's whole family is loyal and brave. Besides, there is a heroine like Mrs. Ji Yu. Ling Li's identity is completely worthy of the princess. Besides, I have heard that the third child of the Ling family is very fond of Su Li. Although he was rejected by the princess in the end, everything depends on human effort. If your majesty grants the marriage, it may be a blessing and solve the marriage problem of the Ling family. Isn't it killing two birds with one stone? Dongfang Xiao smiled but pretended to be sad and sighed. Indeed, Ling Li is ignorant and incompetent. Mrs. Ji Yu has come to me for help more than once. Now the prodigal son has turned over a new leaf. If my niece is willing to marry him, it is not a bad thing. Unfortunately, I don't know if the eighth brother is willing. Ma De was overjoyed and immediately followed Dongfang Xiao's words and said shamelessly, Your Majesty, don't worry. You are the ruler of the country and the elder brother of the eighth lord. The elder brother is the father. It is a great kindness for him to choose a good husband for the princess. How can the eighth lord refuse? Ha 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 ha. Dongfang Xiao heard the words and laughed out loud. You are right. I think too much. Eunuch Feng immediately orders someone to draft the imperial edict. Ma, please go to the Lord Rui's mansion to read the imperial edict later. I hope the eighth brother can understand my painstaking efforts. Your Majesty, is it inappropriate for me to read the imperial edict? It is always. Ma De looked a little embarrassed and looked at Eunuch Feng who stood aside. It was okay that Dongfang Xiao wanted to deal with Lord Rui, but he even wanted him to be a pawn. Why? You don't want to? Dongfang Xiao raised his eyelids and exuded a sense of danger. Ma De was shocked and immediately saluted respectfully. Yes, Your Majesty. At the same time, Ma De smiled bitterly in his heart. He was in a dilemma. If he didn't agree, Dongfang Xiao would punish him. Until he left the imperial study in a daze, he didn't know what he did to make Dongfang Xiao suspect him. I made a wrong choice in the past. In the clear sky outside the imperial study, Ma De exhaled a breath of turbid air. Dongfang Xiao was not a good ruler, but he couldn't hang on to a tree. After Ma De left, Eunuch Feng stood beside Dongfang Xiao with a puzzled face. He really wondered why Ma De was still punished even though he did as Dongfang Xiao said. Dongfang Xiao snorted and woke him up. Send someone to watch Ma De. Don't you think it's too fast to figure out my mind in just 1 hour? Being fast might also be a kind of flaw. Eunuch Feng was shocked and quickly lowered his head. I will arrange it now. The next day. Chapter 266. In the Lord Rui's mansion, Ma De came with the imperial edict. Led by Dongfang Rui, all the people in the Lord Rui's mansion knelt down. Ma De glanced at Dongfang Rui with pity, who had lowered his head. He opened the imperial edict and said loudly, By the will of heaven, the emperor decreed Su Li, the daughter of Prince Dongfang Rui, is virtuous and beautiful. I am very pleased. Now the third son of the Prince of North is young and suitable for marriage. He should choose a good girl as his wife. Su Li is unmarried and is a perfect match for the third son of the Prince of North. In order to fulfill her wish, I will betroth you to Jun Wang as his wife. The Ministry of Rites will arrange the wedding and choose an auspicious day. That's it. What? My brother betroth her to Ling Li of the Ling family? Dongfang Rui was shocked and stood up from the ground. He couldn't believe it. Li was the most talented girl in the capital. How could my brother betroth her to Ling Li, who was ignorant and incompetent? Lord Rui, I know that Princess Li has been living in the affiliated school of the National Academy. You can accept the edict for her. Ma De had a kind smile on his face, but his eyes were very cold. As long as Dongfang Rui dared to refuse, Dongfang Xiao would definitely kill him. His contact with Lord Rui was monitored. He couldn't have anything to do with Dongfang Rui. Dongfang Rui looked pale. He looked at the golden silk paper in Ma De's hand and didn't take it. At this moment, he knew what Su Li meant when she came back to remind him yesterday. No matter what the emperor wants, Dad, just promise him. Don't disobey him. Li could know the action of the emperor brother one step in advance and make countermeasures. How did she do it? Originally, Dongfang Rui thought that even if Su Li hid some secrets, it was just a name to deal with people of the Su family. Until now, he found that he didn't know his daughter at all. Her ability to spy on information was no less than that of some hidden forces in Yunjing City. Lord Rui, Lord Rui. Marda's voice came into Dongfang Rui's ears. Dongfang Rui suddenly came to himself. Marda was not as kind as before, and his words were quite aggressive. He said, Lord Rui, you don't want to accept the imperial edict. Do you want to disobey the imperial edict? Dongfang Rui was shocked and immediately understood Dongfang Xiao's intention. His royal brother actually wanted to lay a hand on him? Why? No wonder Li asked him to accept the request unconditionally. If he refused, it would be the best excuse for Dongfang Xiao to beat him. Unfortunately, Dongfang Rui sneered in his heart. Brother, you would never expect that Li had expected this and arranged everything in advance. If it was before, he would never agree for his daughter, but now, thinking of this, Dongfang Rui took 2 steps forward and gently took the imperial edict in Marda's shocked eyes. He said respectfully, your subject accepts the decree. Dongfang Rui's action was so sudden that Marda and others, who came to read the imperial edict, were all stunned. Even eunuch Feng, who was always expressionless, didn't expect it. He actually accepted the edict. Marda shivered slightly. He pointed at Dongfang Rui, who took the imperial edict, and said in a trembling voice, Lord Rui, you have to think it over. After taking the imperial edict, Princess Li must marry into the Ling family. There is no way out. Are you really willing to do that? Seeing Marda's reaction, Dongfang Rui was a little surprised. He immediately asked with a faint smile, what? Lord Ma seems to be implying something. Marda looked stiff and quickly waved his hand. He said, no. I just asked casually. Since Lord Rui accepted the imperial edict, I will go to the Ministry of Rites. This old man will make a trip to the Ministry of Rites. Farewell. Thank you, Lord Ma. Take care. Dongfang Rui shouted. When Marda and others went out of the Lord Rui's mansion, the smile on his face immediately disappeared, and the hidden anxiety emerged. Wu Bin appeared at the right time and looked serious. He said, I'm going to pick up Miss. Hurry up. Dongfang Rui waved his sleeves and said anxiously. Since Li let him agree, there must be a solution. But when Wu Bin asked Su Li, her answer made Dongfang Rui completely dumbfounded. What? Are you really going to marry Ling Li? Dongfang Rui was so shocked that he patted the table. The tea on the table was spilled everywhere. Su Li looked calm and gently nodded. She said in a calm tone, as if what she said had nothing to do with her. She said, the emperor has issued the imperial edict. Although Ling Li is a playboy, he is not inferior to you in terms of family background. Even if this matter is spread out and causes criticism, it will not cause much trouble. Even if those ministers have objections, Dongfang Xiao is right. The ministers will not embarrass Ms. Ji Yu. Besides, you have just accepted the imperial edict. What can I do to change it? Every word of Su Li hit the nail on the head. Dongfang Rui's heart was cold. It turned out that there were so many twists and turns hidden in it. He didn't think of it before. In this case, why do you want me to accept the imperial edict? Li, this is a lifelong event for you. How can the bastard of the Ling family be worthy of you? How can I explain it to your mother? Dongfang Rui sighed bitterly. Then his eyes suddenly brightened and he said, Li, I can let Wu Bin escort you to leave the Dahan country. As long as you are out of the control of the Dahan country, even Dongfang Xiao can punish you. Wu Bin, it's useless. Before Dongfang Rui finished his words, he was interrupted by Su Li. Father, Dongfang Xiao is so cunning. Since he wants to deal with you, he must be well prepared. If you refuse to accept the imperial edict, the royal guards will destroy the Lord Rui's mansion within half a day. If you accept the imperial edict and let me escape, I will be caught by the royal guards before I see the gate of Yunjing. All the people in the Lord Rui's mansion are like birds in a cage at this moment. They can only act according to the imperial edict. Otherwise, they will die. Father, don't you understand? Every word of Su Li was like a sharp sword stabbing into Dongfang Rui's chest. The latter retreated a few steps with a pale face. He thought that there was still room for turning back. It turned out that Dongfang Xiao had come to this step. But I don't want you to be wronged. Dongfang Rui grasped Su Li's hand tightly. His eyes were full of sincerity. Since Su Yu left, there was only Su Li in his life. If his life could help Su Li regain her freedom, he would not hesitate. But now, even if he resisted, Su Li's ending would not be better than now. Feeling the warmth from Dongfang Rui's palm, Su Li smiled gently. She stretched out her hand to smooth the wrinkles between Dongfang Rui's eyebrows. Her voice was like a soft spring breeze blowing in Dongfang Rui's ears. Father, it is the greatest luck for me to recognize you in this life. I don't dare to ask for more. Li, Dongfang Rui was moved. Tears flashed in his eyes. But Su Li smiled gently. Fortunately, I didn't kill you in this life. Let me solve all the causes and effects in the remaining time. Father, Ling Li is not as simple as you think. In fact, the first imperial edict that Dongfang Xiao made was made by Ma Jintian. Su Li smiled like a flower and gently explained, after I influenced him several times, he became Ling Li. Speaking of it, I chose the third child of the Ling family by myself. I am willing to marry him. Hearing this, Dongfang Rui's sadness on his face turned into astonishment. He was born in the royal family and was used to intrigue. But now in front of his daughter's stratagem, he was a little brainless. Su Li had been living outside the palace all the time. She had never entered the palace. How could she influence the choice of marriage partner? Li, what are you? Before Dongfang Rui finished his words, he was stopped by Su Li's fingertips. Su Li showed a beautiful smile. Her eyes were as bright as the sea. She said, Father, there are some things that I can't say. When the time is right, you will know everything. As for now, please prepare a good dowry for me. Dongfang Rui stared at Su Li in a daze. After a long silence, he finally smiled and said, You are my only daughter. I will prepare a good dowry for you. You will get married in a grand way. You will be as good as the princess. Thank you, Father. Su Li smiled sweetly and stayed in the Lord Rui's mansion for the night. In the next few days, she lived in the Lord Rui's mansion. She was very clear about her situation. If she didn't live in the Lord Rui's mansion now, she would have fewer chances to live in the Lord Rui's mansion in the future. Dongfang Rui was completely busy. He took a lot of gold and silver jewelry for Su Li to choose every day. Although he didn't know what Su Li was planning, he chose to believe his daughter unconditionally. Right now, he could only pray that Yun's spirit in heaven would protect their daughter from suffering and troubles. When the Lord Rui's mansion was busy preparing the dowry, the people of the Ling mansion were stunned by the sudden news. The emperor bestowed a marriage to Su Li. After Mrs. Jiyu and Qiu Meng received the imperial edict from eunuch Feng, they were stunned for a long time. Then Qiu Meng was ecstatic and immediately came to the east courtyard to tell Ling Li the good news. Li, come out. Don't stay in the room. It's great news. Your grandfather bestowed a marriage to Miss Su Li, whom you like. Ling Li, who was dealing with the information of the Tianya house in the room, heard his mother's voice. He was so scared that he stuffed all the information under the table. When he just finished, he heard Qiu Meng opening the door and coming in. Where did Ling Mo go? Why didn't he stop her for a moment? Ling Li complained for a while. Then his mind returned to what Qiu Meng said. His eyes suddenly became dull because of extreme shock. He trembled and asked, Mother, what did you say? Qiu Meng was full of joy. She quickly spread the imperial edict in front of Ling Li. It was written clearly on the yellow silk and black characters. Su Li and I will choose a good day to get married. Ling Li was stunned. At this moment, he seemed to be unable to think. He thought that it was impossible for him to marry Su Li in this life. Unexpectedly, an imperial edict suddenly came from the sky. He never thought that he and Su Li would get married in such a ridiculous way. Master. Ling Mo rushed in with a trace of eccentricity and joy on his face. When he saw Madam was also here, he immediately swallowed his words. It seemed that Master had already known it. Chapter 267. In the imperial palace, Marder knelt on the ground, and his face almost touched the floor. He even breathed cautiously, for fear of breaking Dongfang Xiao's heart. My eighth brother didn't have any reaction and just agreed. And he even prepared the dowry by himself. You even set the date. 2 days later. There was a faint smile on Dongfang Xiao's face, but the coldness in his words was so cold that Eunuch Feng couldn't help but shiver and bend his back even more. Your Majesty, what I said is true. The eighth lord only hesitated for a moment and directly took the imperial edict without any other excessive reaction. Eunuch Feng was also there at that time. If I lied, I would be struck by lightning. Enough. Dongfang Xiao impatiently interrupted Marder's words. He stomped a few steps with a gloomy face. Suddenly, he picked up the memorial on the table and smashed it on Marder's head. He scolded, "Useless thing, get out of here." Marder immediately got up from the ground and said while retreating, "Your Majesty, please calm down. I'll get out now, I'll get out now." At this moment, he breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. His Majesty was willing to scold him, which meant that the Ma family could completely withdraw from the whirlpool of the situation and would not be punished again. He had been with Dongfang Xiao for many years. Although he didn't know his temperament completely, he could at least understand 70% of his thoughts. Although Dongfang Xiao was extremely angry at this time, in fact, His Majesty also knew that this time his decision was wrong. Ling Li was just the person he chose according to His Majesty's will. But now when the imperial edict came out, Lord Rui's mansion not only didn't resist, but also happily prepared the dowry. Such a development was almost beyond everyone's expectation. The situation of the royal family is getting more and more complicated. It's not easy to get involved. With this thought in mind, Marder unconsciously walked to the gate of the palace. He looked back at the majestic and spectacular main gate of the palace. He couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. Then he walked away. At the same time, the imperial study of the palace was still so quiet that even the sound of a needle falling could be heard. Dongfang Xiao turned around and sat in front of the table. He gently picked up a thick roll of files, which were all about the countermeasures after Dongfang Rui raised the army to rebel. He originally thought it was quite brilliant. But now, it was all waste paper. Eighth brother, oh, eighth brother, you really hid it well. Even I, your brother, have underestimated you. Looking at the information of Dongfang Rui, Dongfang Xiao sneered and said, everyone thinks that you love your daughter as much as your life. But at the critical moment, you don't hesitate to sell your daughter. It's really embarrassing for me. Your Majesty, excessive anger will harm your body. It's more important to take care of your body. Before Eunuch Feng finished his words, Dongfang Xiao waved his hand to stop him. Dongfang Xiao said calmly, don't worry. I'm not that fragile. Since I have missed the opportunity, I will find another one. The marriage between eighth brother and the Ling family meant that the week would still be weak and not worth worrying about. But this wedding banquet. Dongfang Xiao narrowed his eyes and said, if I don't see it with my own eyes, how can I be satisfied? Feng Xian. Eunuch Feng immediately stepped forward and said, I'm here. Ling Li made a mistake in the early years. Which girl did he peep at? Your Majesty, it's General Wu's daughter, Wu Xiuxiu. Summon her into the palace. Yes. The next day, there was only 1 day left before the wedding. The servants of Lord Rui's mansion and Ling's mansion were so busy. After several days of careful preparation, the Ling's mansion and Lord Rui's mansion were decorated in bright red. It was very festive. The decoration of the east courtyard was more grand. Except for the study, the furniture and decorations in other places were almost replaced with new ones. In the room, Ling Li wore a bright red wedding robe and sat in a wheelchair. He quietly looked at himself in the mirror. Chiu Meng, who personally tied his hair behind him, couldn't help but glance at Ling Li's pale hands. She couldn't help but laugh in her heart. This boy. It was the first time that she saw him so nervous. After so many years, Ling Li indulged in women. She even thought that Ling Li would marry 8 or 10 popular courtesans in the end. Unexpectedly, fate was so magical. This silly boy not only met his sweetheart, but also was lucky to marry her. As his mother, Sometimes she couldn't help but wonder whether she was in a dream. Her son was so lucky. Thinking of this, Chiu Meng stroked a strand of Ling Li's black hair with her fingertips. Looking at the cold and serious face in the mirror, she was slightly surprised. She was used to seeing the little bastard with a crooked head. Why didn't she find that Li was so handsome? He was much more handsome than those boys in Yunjing City who claimed to be handsome. In terms of appearance, Su Li is not at a disadvantage. Chiu Meng thought secretly and sighed, "This is the last time for me to tie your hair. In the future, this job will be handed over to Su Li. You should treat her well and never let her down. Do you understand?" "Yes, mother." Ling Li agreed and smiled bitterly in his heart. Although he didn't know what was going on, there must be something fishy in it. In front of Su Yu's grave in the Osmanthus forest, she clearly drew a clear line. It was good that she didn't come to seek revenge. How could she agree to marry him? All of this was probably just a play by Su Li. But even if it was just a play, even if it was all an illusion and he was deceiving himself, he was willing to cooperate with Su Li and continue to play. The groom's dress was extremely complicated. Ling Li sat for a long time. In the afternoon, Ling Ping, who was in a military uniform, returned to the Ling mansion. When he saw Ling Li, he couldn't help but tease him. "Brother Li, you look like a talented man in this dress, but your expression is not quite right. Why are you so nervous? Others may think that you are going to the battlefield." Ling Li heard the words and smiled bitterly. "Second brother, don't tease me anymore. I am nervous enough." "Hey, Brother Li, you're wrong." Ling Ping waved his hand and said seriously, "You are the son of the Ling family. You can't show fear at any time." "Ping." Before Ling Ping finished his words, Chiu Meng had already walked in. She rolled her eyes at him and said, "Don't make fun of your brother. If you have the ability, find one yourself. I want to see how you can be calm." Since his mother said so, Ling Ping immediately became timid. He shrank his neck and didn't dare to say more. When Ling Li saw this scene, his heavy heart finally relaxed a little. He reluctantly showed a smile, but his expression made Ling Ping frown slightly. When Chiu Meng went out again, there were only Ling Li and Ling Ping in the room. Ling Li glanced at his mother who walked far outside the room. He took off his armor and squatted down to look at Ling Li. He said seriously, "Brother Li, I think you are not right. Tell me the truth. Is there anything you are hiding from me?" Ling Li was stunned. There were too many things he was hiding from his second brother. He didn't know which one Ling Ping was talking about, so he couldn't give a response. Ling Ping thought that Ling Li was self-abased. He couldn't help but sigh secretly. He patted the blanket covering Ling Li's legs and said, "Don't worry. I have seen countless people. Miss Su is really pure. Since she is willing to marry you, she will not dislike you." Ling Li suddenly understood and didn't know what to feel for a while. He had hidden this pair of legs from his family for 10 years. No one knew how many years he would hide it in the future. "Second brother, I understand." Ling Li answered in a low voice. Ling Ping was helpless, but he didn't continue to persuade him. Rome wasn't built in a day. Brother Li's legs had been disabled for so many years. If he could still maintain his confidence, it would be really strange. After seeing his brother, Ling Ping went back to the room and changed into a suit of casual clothes. He immediately came out to help Chiu Meng decorate. He came back for two purposes. One was to act as a facade for his brother, and the other was, the border of Nanjiang country is restless. Maybe I have to go to war immediately after Brother Li gets married. I'd better tell my family after Brother Li gets married. Ling Ping shook his head to dispel distracting thoughts. He had been to the battlefield many times. Now his brother's marriage was the most important thing. Other things were not in his consideration. At night, Ling Li lay on the bed, tossing and turning. He couldn't sleep at all. In the middle of the night, all the people in the Ling mansion fell into a deep sleep. Ling Li got up from the bed and opened the secret compartment under the wardrobe. A set of black clothes came into view. But before he could take off the wedding robe, he was stopped by a pair of hands. "Master, Madam has told me that it's better not to see the bride before getting married. It's inauspicious." Ling Mo said helplessly with dark eyes, Besides, Madam spent a whole day dressing you up. She even let you sleep with your clothes on tonight. If you take off your clothes like this, you will definitely reveal your flaws tomorrow." Ling Li's eyes darkened. He hesitated for a moment and finally let go of the black clothes. He didn't know whether it was the former sentence or the latter sentence that moved him. Seeing Ling Li give up, Ling Mo couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief and immediately put away the black clothes. "Ling Mo, do you think Su Li really wants to marry me?" "Master, you ask the wrong person. If you want to know, isn't it better to ask Madam in person tomorrow?" "Madam?" Ling Li laughed at himself. He turned around and lay down with his eyes closed. Regardless of whether he slept or not, the night would eventually pass. It was the 5th day of March. It was a good day to get married. The whole Yunjing city was bustling early in the morning. The street in front of the Ling mansion was crowded. If the government didn't maintain the order, even the sedan chair for the bride could not go out. People could hear the discussion everywhere in the street. Everyone knew that the first beauty in Yunjing City was going to marry the first playboy in Yunjing City today. When the imperial edict was just issued, almost all the young talents in Yunjing City beat their chests and stamped their feet. They were so angry that they almost wanted to go to the Ling mansion and kill the good-for-nothing, but the imperial edict issued the marriage. Even if they had 100 guts, they didn't dare to destroy the wedding banquet. After several days of preparation, the marriage between Lord Rui's mansion and the Ling family had become the topic of conversation in the whole Yunjing city. It was not strange that there were so many people on the wedding day. Chapter 268. In front of the gate of Lord Rui's mansion, the wedding procession stopped slowly under the gaze of many people. The maids who were watching at the gate immediately dispersed. "They're here, they're finally here." Mammy Li was also dressed in red today. She had been with Su Li all the time. Now that Su Li was getting married, she would accompany her and take care of Su Li's daily life. Seeing the handsome young man sitting on the horse, Mammy Li was overjoyed. She knew some details about Ling Li. At this moment, she couldn't help but secretly rejoice for Su Li that she found such a powerful husband. Under the watchful eyes of everyone, Ling Li was carried down from the special seat of the horse by Ling Mo and put on the wheelchair. He was more nervous and excited. He took a deep breath and barely kept calm. He rocked the wheelchair alone and entered Lord Rui's mansion. He came to the door of Su Li's courtyard unimpeded. Ling Li was surprised. He had also attended many weddings of big families in Yunjing City. The bridegroom would encounter a lot of difficulties when he came to marry the bride, but he didn't encounter many obstacles. Did Lord Rui treat him differently because of the imperial edict? Or, at this moment, suddenly, a horrible strong wind swept behind him. Ling Li's pupils shrank and countless thoughts flashed in his mind. Finally, his tense body suddenly relaxed and he didn't intend to resist. Hum. With a cold hum, the strong wind suddenly disappeared when it approached Ling Li's back. Ling Li narrowed his eyes slightly. The strength dissipated so easily. This person didn't intend to hurt him at all. Was it a test? Ling Li pretended to be confused and looked back. But when he saw the face of the person behind him, the confusion on his face instantly turned into astonishment. The person was dressed as a servant. He looked young and didn't seem to be 18 or 19 years old. He looked cold and quite similar to Ling Mo. But compared with Ling Mo, the expression on his face was much more complicated. "Are you Fang Yuan?" Ling Li found out the name of this person in his mind. Then he noticed that the latter's pneuma was as obscure as the abyss. He was suddenly shocked. He still remembered that when he met Fang Yuan in the Desu town, he hadn't even broken through the inborn hurdle. Now he had the cultivation above the inborn 6th hurdle. It was just over a year. Such a span was really exaggerated. Thinking of Su Li's rapid progress in these years, he suddenly realized that Fang Yuan had been with Su Li all the time. "Child Ling, with your intelligence, it is not difficult to guess my purpose today." Fang Yuan's face was cold and his tone was full of killing intent. He said, "You have hurt her once. If you dare to hurt her in the future, I will exhaust all my knowledge and kill you even if I chase you to the ends of the earth." Ling Li raised his eyebrows slightly. He seemed to be relaxed, but his heart was slightly heavy. He saw from Fang Yuan's eyes. Because he saw the same thing from Fang Yuan's eyes. For Su's Li, Su's heart, of Li Ling Rui Ling Ling, Li A, of King of Ling Ling of Ling Li's Fang, he. Thinking of this, Ling Li took a slight breath and exhaled the cold air in his body. It seemed that Ling Li's anxiety and irritation in the past 3 days were gone. In front of Fang Yuan, he finally recovered some calmness as a hierarch of a great sect. I never want to hurt her. If you come here just to warn me, then, you can get out of the way. Fang Yuan frowned, but he was reluctant to get out of the way. His beloved woman was behind the door. She would marry the man in front of him today. If he could, he would rather stand here all his life and never give way. However, everything that was happening right now was her idea. Fang Yuan was a little bitter. After his family was ruined, he wandered from place to place with his sister. He thought that he had suffered all kinds of hardships in the world. But today he knew that there was another kind of bitterness. It was extremely bitter and more unbearable than all the previous ones. Remember what I said. Fang Yuan finally got out of the way. Ling Li took a deep look at Fang Yuan, whose eyes were as sharp as a blade. Then he entered the yard in his wheelchair. In the new yard, Su Li wore a red veil and sat quietly at the stone table. Mammy Li had come to the yard in advance and waited for Su Li. She was very happy. Originally, the bride was supposed to wait in the room, but the miss said that she didn't want to. Finally, she waited in the yard. The emperor's marriage was a symbol of destiny. At the moment, time was tight, so many rules were omitted. So, this rule was not a big deal. After a while, the sound of the wheelchair came into their ears. Mammy Li's face immediately brightened. She came forward and said happily, "Child, you are finally here." Ling Li saw that Su Li was sitting in the yard, and he couldn't help but be astonished. In this way, she probably heard every word of the voice outside the yard. Mammy Li didn't notice Ling Li's reaction. She walked to the back of the wheelchair and pushed Ling Li to Su Li. She said, "Child, don't be in a daze. You should take the miss out. Don't delay the time." Mammy Li took the red ribbon and stuffed one end into Su Li's hands. Then she handed the other end to Ling Li. Ling Li immediately reacted. He clenched the red ribbon that was connected with Su Li and nodded, "Mammy, you are right. Let's go out." "Oh, okay," Mammy Li promised with a smile. She helped Ling Li push the wheelchair to the gate. But she laughed in her heart. Child Ling, who was so high-spirited in the yard in the valley, was so nervous today. He didn't even know how to speak. It was really interesting. When they came out of the yard again, Ling Li didn't see Fang Yuan again. He clenched the red ribbon in his hand and turned his head. His eyes never left Su Li. Although he couldn't see Su Li's face, he knew that it was Su Li just by looking at her figure. Today, Su Li was not as fierce and crazy as she was in the Osmanthus forest that day. She walked lightly and followed the wheelchair step by step. She seemed quiet and gentle. In a trance, Ling Li returned to the days when he and Su Li traveled together in Yunjing. They only envied the mandarin ducks but not the immortals. Unfortunately, those days had been fragmented with the disaster. A group of 3 people walked to the gate of Lord Rui's mansion. The people who had been waiting immediately became noisy. The noise was endless. "Come out! Come out! Princess Li is coming. Princess Li must be dressed very beautifully. It's a pity that the playboy of the Ling family got lucky. We have no chance to see her. Hateful. Hateful. How could Ling Li be so lucky? I really envy him." Dongfang Rui saw the 3 people coming out. When he saw Ling Li's appearance, he couldn't help but feel relieved. He could see that Ling Li really liked his daughter. At least, Li would not be wronged if she joined the Ling mansion. After Su Li got into the sedan chair, the MC of the Ministry of Rites shouted, "Start the sedan chair." The wedding procession set off to go back. The people who were watching followed the wedding procession. The whole street was moving with them. Soon, the gate of Lord Rui's mansion became deserted. Dongfang Rui was full of complex feelings. He took a long breath and said, "Let's go." "Yes, master." Wu Bin secretly wiped away his tears and felt sorry for his master. Just because of an imperial edict, Miss had to marry into such a shady marriage. Master must be very sad in his heart. After 2 hours, the wedding procession was like a long dragon. It finally stopped in front of the Ling mansion. When Ling Li turned his wheelchair and stopped in front of the sedan chair, the MC of the Ministry of Rites immediately shouted, "Start the sedan chair." The bride and groom get up. Bo. Ling Li immediately cupped his hands to the sedan chair and looked attentive. Mammy Li looked solemn, but her eyes were sparkling with joy. Mammy Li lifted the curtain of the sedan chair and let Su Li come out. Then she handed the red ribbon to Su Li again. The bride and groom go straight to the front of the flower hall. Burn incense. Kneel down. Kowtow once, twice, and thrice. The MC's voice continued. After they burned incense, they went through a series of complicated rules. Finally, they came to the main hall of the Ling mansion. At a glance, Ling Li saw his grandma, Ms. Ji Yu, sitting on the right side. She smiled so much that the wrinkles on her face gathered together. On the left side, Dongfang Rui looked sad and happy. Chiu Meng and Ling Ping stood beside Ms. Ji Yu. There was joy in Ling Ping's eyes, but he was still calm. Chiu Meng had already burst into tears and cried. Bow to heaven and earth, the MC's voice was long. Ling Li turned his wheelchair and turned his back to the hall. He hesitated for a moment and wanted to get down from the wheelchair. People in the Ling mansion saw this scene, and they immediately changed their expressions. Even the whispers among the audience became smaller. In a blink of an eye, the hall was silent. What's wrong with Li? He is ill. He can bow from afar. Why does he get down? Chiu Meng was anxious and wanted to go forward, but she was stopped by Ling Ping. Mother, I think Brother Li just doesn't want to have any regrets. Let him go. Even if he falls, he is willing. If you help him, Brother Li will feel uncomfortable. Chiu Meng's heart was twisted. She said, silly boy, why didn't he tell me anything? Even if I prepared a crutch for him, it would be much better than now. Ling Qinglan, who was also in the audience seat, saw this scene and couldn't help but shake his head slightly. Ling Li clearly knew that the deeper he fell in love, the more painful he would be in the future, but he didn't mean to give up. People who fell in love were difficult to understand, at least he couldn't understand. Thinking of this, Ling Qinglan's lips moved slightly, and a sound was transmitted to Ling Li. To ensure that there is no mistake, you sealed your tendons and meridians yesterday. Now your legs are really useless. If you want to kneel down from the wheelchair without exposing your cultivation, you will be embarrassed a lot. It's better to forget it. Ling Li lowered his head and gritted his teeth. He tried to prop up his upper body without any pause. Ling Qinglan frowned. His voice was clearly transmitted to Ling Li, but Ling Li didn't seem to hear it at all. Ling Li moved too slowly. Gradually, there were whispers among the people who watched the ceremony. What's going on? How can he marry Su Li? What a shame. I can't stand it. Hush, keep your voice down. Ling Li heard every word. His face was slightly gloomy. Every word was like a knife stabbing his heart. He began to speed up. It didn't matter that he lost face, but he didn't want Su Li to be laughed at with him. However, it was difficult for a person whose cultivation and strength were sealed to get down from the wheelchair with only his hands. As expected, Ling Li's hands suddenly lost balance before long. Chapter 269. There was a loud noise. The wheelchair fell to the ground, and Ling Li also fell from it. The maids were so scared that they covered their eyes. Many kind-hearted onlookers also turned their heads and couldn't bear to see it. Just at this moment, a pair of seemingly delicate hands suddenly appeared and held Ling Li's waist tightly, making him kneel on the ground steadily. Maybe because of the big movement, the red veil slipped off. Su Li's beautiful face was immediately seen by everyone, which made them exclaim in amazement. What a beautiful girl! Princess Li is really a beauty. I really envy the third master of the Ling family. There was a lot of discussion in the hall. In the blink of an eye, the scandal of Ling Li was overshadowed. Ling Li stared at Su Li. It seemed that time was stagnant when they looked at each other. Wow! Another burst of exclamation pulled Ling Li back to reality. It turned out that the onlookers looked back and set off a small climax. Qiumeng saw the scene in the hall and immediately breathed a sigh of relief. She looked at Su Li more kindly than before and even a little more grateful. Su Li's master was the imperial preceptor. Her cultivation was also among the best among many misses in Yunjing City. It was said that she had acquired the 8th hurdle. Although she had never seen Su Li's skills, if she only helped Ling Li to stabilize his body, the red veil on her head would not fall off. This girl did it on purpose to help Ling Li out of trouble. Mrs. Jiyu looked more sincere with a faint smile on her face. She looked at Su Li very kindly and said, "It's a blessing of our Ling family that you can help my grandson so unobtrusively. You are so considerate." When Mammy Li picked up the red veil and covered Su Li's face again, the 3 bows could finally continue without any hindrance. Second, bow to your parents. Husband and wife bow to each other. The ceremony is finished, send them to the bridal chamber. With the MC's last words, Dongfang Rui and Ms. Jiyu both breathed a sigh of relief at the same time. The old and the young looked at each other for a moment and smiled. Both of them had unknown meanings. Qiumeng burst into tears. She leaned against Ling Ping, crying and laughing. She murmured, "Great, great. Li finally has a family. It's great." After Mammy Li led Su Li out of the main hall, the banquet began. The banquet spread from the courtyard of the main hall to both sides of the street outside the Ling mansion, attracting a large number of ordinary people to come to the banquet. It could be said that on this day, because of the marriage between the Ling mansion and the Lord Rui's mansion, almost half of Yunjing City was lively. Ling Li sat back in the wheelchair with the help of Ling Mo. As soon as he came out of the seats in the inner hall, he was surrounded by a group of young talents. "Young Royal Prince, let me toast you. Congratulations, young Royal Prince, for winning the beauty. Come, young Royal Prince, today is your big day, so you can't refuse wine." Ling Li smiled and drank the wine without saying anything. Others thought he was really happy. Only Ling Mo, who was beside the wheelchair, knew that he was not as happy as he looked at the moment. "All right. The young Royal Prince is indeed straightforward. Here's another toast to you." Ling Li almost didn't refuse anyone. He sealed his cultivation, and soon he was drunk. His eyes were hazy. Ling Mo looked at him and wanted to help him drink. At this moment, there was a burst of hearty laughter outside the courtyard. "Ha ha ha, it's so lively." Many civil and military officials who were familiar with the voice immediately changed their expressions. They put down the wine and dishes in their hands, came to the gate, and knelt down. "Welcome, Your Majesty. Welcome, Your Majesty. Long live the Emperor." Dongfang Rui and others at the main table in the hall changed their expressions slightly. They immediately came out and happened to meet Dongfang Xiao, who just came in from the gate. Mrs. Jiyu narrowed her eyes slightly and returned to normal in an instant. She walked over with her crutch and was about to salute, saying, "Your Majesty." Dongfang Xiao quickly held Mrs. Jiyu and smiled hypocritically, "You are so polite. I'm really flattered." Mrs. Jiyu raised her eyebrows and pretended to sigh, "It's rare that Your Majesty can call me sister-in-law." Dongfang Xiao became serious and said solemnly, "Eldest brother, I will never forget your kindness in those years. Now you and I are old, and many people have passed away. If I don't get close to you, who else can I talk to?" Dongfang Xiao's words seemed to be sincere, which made many guests feel sentimental. It turned out that the emperor had such a relationship with the Ling family. It was not easy for the emperor to keep his original intention after so many years. Mrs. Gu's expression was not very good at the moment. She could only force a smile and said, "Your Majesty, you are busy with state affairs. This time, you not only arrange a marriage for my grandson, but also attend the wedding banquet in person. I'm really honored. Please sit in the inner hall." Dongfang Xiao squinted and nodded, "Okay." Ling Ping followed at the end with a respectful look, but a cold light flashed in his eyes from time to time. Dongfang Xiao really deserved to be the emperor for decades. He was eloquent, but he didn't come to pay homage to his grandfather in these years. After a group of people entered the house, the courtyard became boisterous again, and it became more boisterous than before. Many people were talking about various things that the Ling family fought for the De Han country in those years. Some people even whispered and talked about the secrets of those years. I heard that back then, His Majesty and old General Ling became sworn brothers, and the two brothers worked together to conquer this great land. His Majesty originally had the status of a powerful family, and it was only because old General Ling purposely gave way that the position of emperor fell to His Majesty. Later, old General Ling got married and established a career. Like father, like son. General Ling also made great achievements for the Dahan country. Your Majesty promised the title of Lord of North to General Ling plus the legend of Mrs. Ling. General Ling's mansion was respected. The old people chatted in private, but the young people still surrounded Ling Li to toast. At this moment, Ling Li was extremely drunk. If he didn't sit in a wheelchair and was accompanied by Ling Mo, he would have been lying on the table. Among this group of people, the young man who made the most effort to toast saw this scene. He felt it was enough and made a gesture. Not long after, a young girl with a graceful figure leisurely walked over. Many young geniuses were stunned when they saw her. Wasn't she the miss of General Wu's mansion, Wu Xiuxiu? She was almost molested by Ling Li in those years. She should avoid the Ling mansion. Why did she appear here? Ling Mo was shocked and felt that something was wrong. But it was too late for him to stop her. Wu Xiuxiu was anxious to obey Dongfang Xiao's order. She showed a hint of bitterness on her face. Her soft words made many child's hearts flutter. Although Wu Xiuxiu's appearance was not as good as that of Su Li, the fairy in the human world, her charm was not possessed by ordinary women. Childling, I haven't seen you for a long time. I didn't expect that you are going to get married. Ling Li put down the glass and turned his head. There was a trace of doubt on his flushed face. He stammered, who are you? As soon as he said this, people around immediately burst into laughter. They thought that Wu Xiuxiu's appearance could make Ling Li, who was lustful, embarrassed. Unexpectedly, it was Wu Xiuxiu who was embarrassed instead of Ling Li. Wu Xiuxiu was so angry that she wanted to leave. But when she thought of Dongfang Xiao's order, she had to bear it. She continued to test, Ling Li, don't you even know me? I've seen a lot of men like you, eating from the bowl while looking at the pot. If I'm willing to be your second wife, won't you agree? Even Wu Xiuxiu felt that her face was burning when she said such shameless words. If it weren't for her family, she wouldn't come here to say these disgusting words to this good-for-nothing. Others didn't know what she was thinking. But after her words, more people gathered around to watch. Miss Wu thinks highly of herself. I didn't expect that she could say such words. It's really an eye-opener for me. I think Miss Wu just comes to test Ling Li because of jealousy. She wants to make Princess Li embarrass. If Ling Li really covets her, then Princess Li. Tut-tut, Ling Li is lustful. I don't think it's possible. Princess Li will be humiliated before they consummate their marriage. Wu Xiuxiu snorted and crossed her arms in front of her chest. She waited for Ling Li to show his embarrassment. She specially dressed up in order to seduce Ling Li. At this moment, Ling Li was drunk. Even if he was sober, he would have an impulse. Ling Mo stood beside the wheelchair and was expressionless like a block of wood. He didn't mean to stop her at all. He had already seen the purpose of Wu Xiuxiu's coming. No matter whether there was someone behind her, what he wanted to know was whether Ling Li was sincere in this marriage. If it was sincere, there was no flaw. Even if someone wanted to make a fuss about the marriage, there was no breakthrough. If not, thinking of this, Ling Mo smiled slightly. Crack. Ling Li suddenly stared. It seemed that his reverse scale was touched. His red face was full of anger. He directly smashed the wine glass in his hand. He pointed at Wu Xiuxiu's nose and scolded, "Where do you come from? Get out of here." The whole scene suddenly became quiet. No one expected that Ling Li would suddenly get angry. Wu Xiuxiu was even more stunned by the sudden scolding. Before she responded, Ling Li suddenly retracted his hand and hammered his chest fiercely. He shouted, "I only love Su Li in my life and will only marry her. Since God allows me to marry her, I will never touch any other woman in my life. If I break this oath, I will be struck by lightning. You, who do you think you are? You can't even compare with Su Li. Do you want me to marry you?" Wu Xiuxiu was at a loss for a moment. She didn't expect that Ling Li would react like this. Puff. Ha ha ha. After a moment of silence, someone finally couldn't help laughing. Wu Xiuxiu's eyes suddenly turned red. She didn't remember Dongfang Xiao's order in her mind. She cried and ran all the way out of the Ling mansion. There was a smile on Ling Mo's indifferent face. He persuaded helplessly, "Master, you can't drink anymore. It's almost time. You have to consummate your marriage in the evening. Young masters, please excuse me." Chapter 270. After 5 minutes, Ling Mo pushed the wheelchair into the east courtyard. The noise of the main hall courtyard came from far away, which made the east courtyard particularly quiet. Ling Mo looked around and didn't find anyone except the hidden guards of the Enmore cult. He reached out to draw out the silver needles from Ling Li's waist, but a hand suddenly stopped him at this moment. Ling Mo was stunned. "Master, aren't you drunk?" Ling Li, who was drunk and unconscious, slowly raised his head. Although his face was still red, his eyes were clear. He said slowly, "Dongfang Xiao suddenly arranged a marriage. There are a lot of tricks in it. How can I not prepare a little bit? Even if I seal my cultivation, it is not so easy to get drunk." Then, Ling Li looked at the brightly lit bridal chamber in the courtyard and glanced at Ling Mo, who was still standing aside. Ling Mo immediately understood and left the courtyard. Seeing Ling Li push the door open and turn the wheelchair to go in, Ling Mo sighed in his heart and turned around to disappear into the night. Ling Li gently closed the door and pulled out the silver needles from his waist. The genuine energy in his body ran and he looked up at the room. The red candles were swaying and the light made it a little warm. In the translucent curtain, Su Li with a red veil sat on the edge of the bed with a red wedding quilt. She looked very cute. This was the wedding night of him and Su Li. Ling Li's throat rolled. He pushed the wheelchair and stood up. After hesitating for a moment, he opened the curtain and sat beside Su Li. He picked up the wedding scale on the table and was about to lift the red veil. At the moment when he was about to lift it, the red veil suddenly slipped off and floated to the ground. Ling Li stared at the red silk blankly. When he raised his head, he saw a cold face. The cold eyes almost chilled him to the bone. Even the fiery red lips seemed to be frozen, and he couldn't feel any warmth. Dong, the wedding scale fell to the ground. Ling Li was full of bitterness. "Li, you, Ling Li, pay attention to your address." Su Li's eyes were extremely cold. She interrupted Ling Li's words. "Do you still naively think that I will marry you sincerely? The revenge of my aunt is absolutely irreconcilable. If it is not for the overall situation, do you think I will let you go?" Ling Li's heart ached. His face was slightly pale and his eyes were deep. He couldn't say a word for a long time. Su Li forcibly suppressed the discomfort in her heart and then sneered, "Yes, I used you this time to protect Lord Rui's mansion. I will call you husband in front of others in the future." As for others, at this point, Ling Li suddenly caught a glimpse of a shadow outside the door. His eyes immediately changed. He directly held Su Li's waist and lay on the bed. The curtains on both sides fell. At the same time, outside the door, Ling Liuyi and others squatted in the corner, listening attentively. They stared at the room that was still lit, and the sound transmission was extremely complicated. "How? Did you hear anything?" Ling Ling said. "Ling Li courtyard. Ling courtyard." Ling Liuyi's face changed slightly, and he immediately took people to slip away. When he was about to climb over the wall, he turned back unconsciously and happened to see Ling Mo among a group of maids and servants. Ling Liuyi was eavesdropping by the window as they did just now. Ling Liuyi held back his laughter and immediately climbed over the wall. He didn't expect that Ling Li, who had always been insensitive, would gossip like them. In the bed covered by the curtain, Ling Li covered Su Li's mouth with one hand. He listened to the movement outside the room quietly, but he didn't find that his whole body was on Su Li's. Su Li's eyes widened slightly. She was ashamed and annoyed. She pushed Ling Li away. Ling Li didn't stop and hit the wall directly, making a clear sound. A group of maids and servants outside immediately became restless. I heard it. What a loud sound. Ling Mo straightened up and looked strange. The sound just now seemed to be that someone hit the wall. Did Su Li fight with the master? Hiss. Ling Li shook his head and sat up from the bed. Su Li felt distressed. She stretched out her hand and woke up in the middle. Then she retracted her hand quickly. Her face was cold again. You are really cruel. Ling Li smiled bitterly and rubbed his head. He lowered his voice and said, there are people peeping outside. At least we need to pretend. Su Li snorted and turned her head away. She curled up in the corner of the quilt and lay down. After a long time, she said faintly, you cannot get out of bed, but, don't touch me. Ling Li was a little relieved. He carefully lifted the other end of the quilt, but found that there were red dates and lotus seeds and other things under the quilt. It was so hard that it bumped against his body. He shook his head helplessly and lay directly on the quilt. The room suddenly became quiet, and only their breathing could be heard. After a long time, Ling Li opened his eyes in the quiet room. He turned his head and saw Su Li's black hair bun. He smelled the delicate fragrance of a virgin. He hesitated for a moment and ran the genuine energy to move his body inch by inch. He didn't stop until he was about to touch Su Li. The fragrance was more intense. Ling Li raised his slender hand and wanted to touch Su Li's hair, which was like a waterfall on the quilt. But he stopped at last, for fear that he would wake her up and she would be angry again. Thinking of this, Ling Li's eyes were gentle. He was ready to watch Su Li and wait for the morning quietly while listening to her regular breath. If he could stay with her like this in this life, even if she was serious to him or even hated him, he would be satisfied. The night was destined to be long. Ling Li suddenly remembered what Su Li said before. She was willing to marry him in order to protect the Lord Rui's mansion. Although Dongfang Xiao was no longer afraid of the Ling family in these years, he was determined not to let the Ling family and the Lord Rui's mansion cooperate and grow. Something must have happened. He quickly thought of the recent rumors about Ma Jintian and realized that Dongfang Xiao's first choice should be Ma Jintian. In this way, Su Li almost gave herself to Ma Jintian. Ling Li's eyes flashed with anger. Just thinking about it made him angry. It took him a long time to calm down. When Ling Li was thinking about it, he didn't find that Su Li suddenly opened her eyes for a moment. She felt his breath rising and falling on her neck. Her eyes flashed, but she did nothing and closed her eyes again. It was a silent night. In the morning of the next day, Su Li opened her eyes and sat up. She was still dressed neatly. She frowned slightly and looked back at Ling Li, who was still sleeping. Her eyes flashed a little. She hesitated for a moment and untied her clothes and threw them on the ground. Then she got out of bed and opened the kitchen door to see what she could wear. Fortunately, the Ling residence was well prepared. Half of the wardrobes in the bridal chamber were filled with women's clothing, all prepared for her. She casually picked a light yellow dress and wore it. Then, she combed her hair into a bun. Only then did a group of maids arrive with the toiletries. The head maid was quite clever. She saw that the curtain had been lifted. She couldn't help but look to the side in confusion. She saw the beautiful woman sitting in the dressing room without any makeup. She opened her lips slightly and hurriedly walked over. She bowed her head and said nervously, "Mistress, you get up so early. I'm here to help you and the master to wash and change clothes." Su Li slightly pursed her red lips and rolled her starry eyes. The little maid's heart was pounding. They all stayed with Madame Chiu Meng before. They were specially selected by Madame to serve the mistress. In the future, the princess in front of them would be their master. How could they not be nervous? Su Li was so clever that she quickly figured out the origin of these maids. She smiled slightly and ordered, "Put them down. I will serve my husband personally. You can leave." Yes. The maids didn't dare to disobey. They quickly put down everything and left the door. It is said that the mistress is gentle and virtuous. I didn't expect that she is so overbearing. However, young master is very fortunate to have young mistress protecting him like this. The maids whispered to each other, but the scene in the room was different. After Su Li washed slowly, Ling Li slowly woke up. He pretended to be confused and sat up. Looking at the messy clothes on the ground, If he hadn't slept at all yesterday, he would have thought that he and Su Li had consummated their marriage. He wore a white shirt and got out of bed. Seeing Su Li in a light yellow dress, his face was slightly hot. He didn't sleep at all in the morning. Naturally, he saw the whole process of Su Li changing clothes. After taking off the red wedding robe and gauze, there was only the belliband left. Hurry up and wash and change clothes. It's time to serve tea. Hearing Su Li's voice, Ling Li immediately woke up. He quickly went to the table to wash and took out a black robe from the wardrobe to put it on. But when it came to tie his hair, he was embarrassed. There were laws in Dahan country. The style of a man's hair was completely different before and after marriage. But he only knew this rule. He didn't know the specific style and how to tie his hair. For a moment, Ling Li sat in front of the bronze mirror and looked at himself with disheveled hair. He sighed and didn't do anything. He never thought that one day he would be puzzled by a simple hairstyle. Su Li sat at the round table and waited. Seeing that there was no movement in the inner room for a long time, she got up and walked a few steps lightly. Then she saw Ling Li with soft black hair. His eyes were melancholy, which made him handsome. A trace of softness flashed in her eyes. She walked over quietly, grabbed the comb in Ling Li's hand with her right hand and combed it gently. Ling Li was stunned immediately. "Li, don't get me wrong." Su Li didn't raise her head and said faintly, "I just do it for myself. At least before the decline of the Dongfang family, you and I can't show any flaws." Ling Li was silent. Although Su Li reminded him of the relationship between them all the time, he couldn't calm down now that Su Li was beside him and helped him tie his hair on the first day of their marriage. "Well, let's go out." Su Li adjusted Ling Li's lapel and turned around to push the wheelchair over. When Ling Li saw his appearance in the mirror, he couldn't help but be stunned. It turned out that the ordinary hair could be so beautiful. Su Li's hairstyle seemed to be designed for him. It set off his face perfectly. In addition, there was a wisp of green in the bun. It was really a perfect masterpiece. Li's movements are so skillful. She is faster than me. Chapter 271. Mom, Grandma, have some tea. In the central room, Chiu Meng and Mrs. Jiu looked at Su Li, who was kneeling on the ground, and took the tea. Their eyes flashed with love. Especially Chiu Meng, she really liked Su Li from the bottom of her heart. "One of you is Ling Li, and the other is Su Li. I don't know how to address you. Su Li, since you are willing to marry my grandson, the Ling family will treat you well. You will also have a share of the property of the Ling family," Mrs. Jiu said, and took out a stack of shop deeds. It seemed that she was going to completely hand over some of the property of the Ling family to Su Li. Su Li was stunned and quickly waved her hand. "Grandma, I just got married. How can I accept the property of the family? I can't accept it. If you really want to give it to me, just give it to my husband." Hearing this, both Mrs. Jiu and Chiu Meng were stunned, especially Chiu Meng, who was deeply moved. The value of the shop deeds given by Mrs. Jiu was not low. They almost accounted for a quarter of the property of the Ling family. Even if it was presented to Lord Rui, it would be important. But Su Li refused without hesitation. This child really likes San Mrs. Jiu was also satisfied. She was determined to give up a quarter of the property to help Ling Li and to show Lord Rui. But it was also a kind of test. If Su Li immediately accepted it happily, she would not like this little girl. But from the moment she refused, she had really regarded Su Li as a member of the Ling family. "Okay, don't kneel." Chiu Meng couldn't help helping Su Li up. She pulled Su Li and said, "The breakfast is ready. It is made by your grandma. Your grandma hasn't cooked for many years." Ling Li helplessly watched Su Li being pulled away by his mother. It was just a day after they got married. His status in the family was not much better than that of ordinary servants. "If mother knows that it is just a play between Su Li and me," Ling Li sighed and didn't dare to think about it. After Chiu Meng and Su Li left, there were only two people in the room. It was Mrs. Jiu Yang. Ling Li turned his head and braced himself to say, "Grandma, what can I do for you?" Jiu Yang's expression was serious, and her voice was piercingly cold, with a bit of the murderous spirit of youth. Su Li is a good daughter, and you can't let her down. In the past, you were young and unmarried, so I couldn't control how you spent your time. But now that you are married and have a family, my Ling family values sincerity. If you dare to go to that kind of place again, I won't recognize you as my grandson. Jiyu Yang's words were serious, and Ling Li couldn't help but be moved. Although he was a little, he didn't care. Ling Li couldn't help but be angry. He grinned and moved his wheelchair closer to Jiyu Yang's side. He laughed and said, "Grandson will remember. Grandma, don't be angry. Mother and the others have gone to eat. Let's go too." Jiyu Yang saw Ling Li's reaction. It was clear that he didn't take her words seriously. A trace of disappointment flashed in her eyes. She shook her head and got up to walk to the table, but she didn't see Ling Li behind her. He was more than serious. Everything he said was true. The breakfast of the Ling family was extremely rich, and the four people had a good time eating together. Su Li behaved very naturally and didn't let Chiu Meng and Mrs. Jiyu see any flaws. Ling Li ate quietly, but he felt bitter in his heart. These dishes were picked by Su Li. He knew that Su Li was just acting. As long as they were alone, she would be beaten back to the original state. But he still couldn't help but hope that everything in front of him was true. How good it would be. After dinner, Su Li followed Ling Li back to the east courtyard. Ling Li had been living in seclusion for more than half a year. It was said that he changed his lecherous habits for Su Li, so no one thought it was strange. When they returned to the east courtyard, they happened to meet the maids who were cleaning the room. Ling Li glanced at them and was about to go to the study. He saw a maid open the soft cloth on the bed and took out a piece of white cloth dyed with red. Then she hurried away. "What's that?" Ling Li was slightly shocked and quickly thought of something. But before he could respond, he found that his right arm was held by someone and dragged to the other side. At the same time, Su Li whispered in his ear, "Honey, aren't you going to show me the collection in the study today? What are you doing?" When his right arm touched the softness, Ling Li was a little confused and was immediately dragged away by Su Li. The maids envied them again. Master and Madam are inseparable. They are really in love. At this time, the two people who were in love came to the study, but they immediately separated. The atmosphere gradually became stagnant. Ling Li frowned and couldn't help but ask, "What's the matter with the red?" Although he had never intercourse with women in his 2 lives, the information on the earth was so advanced in the previous life. Even if he didn't try it himself, he naturally knew the secrets between men and women. Last night, they didn't consummate. How could there be red? Su Li looked indifferent and turned her back as if she was looking at the books in the room. She said, "If we don't do this, how can we confuse the fake with the real one? It's just a little blood. Don't worry about it." Ling Li became more and more annoyed. His eyes darkened and he stood up directly from the wheelchair. He pulled Su Li's right arm and pulled the sleeve. The strength of the inborn warrior was so great that Su Li's right sleeve was completely torn, revealing a fresh wound. "It should be yesterday. Don't you apply medicine to such a deep wound?" Ling Li finally knew where the red came from. He was angry and distressed. When he was about to use genuine energy to treat Su Li, he was pushed away by Su Li. Her cold words pierced his heart like a knife. "You don't need to be hypocritical. I have said that. Except in front of outsiders, we don't interfere with each other. As the hierarch, you are busy. I won't bother you anymore. I will come back in the evening." Then Su Li directly opened the tunnel mechanism in the room, jumped down and disappeared. Ling Li stood alone on the edge of the tunnel. After a long time, he raised his head and looked serious. He said, "Li has reached the inborn 9th hurdle. Why didn't the wound heal itself after one night?" Even though every word of Su Li made his heart bleed since they met, he didn't complain at all. He was still worried about Su Li's safety. Except for Ling Li himself, no one knew what he was thinking about. Linli Building. On the first day of Su Li's wedding, the door of the Linli Building was closed. In the underground adytum, all the leaders of the Linli Building sat in a circle, including Wen Tingshan. Su Li has no choice but to marry into the Ling mansion. This matter is urgent. No one knows what Su Li thinks. What should we do in the future? Chu Qingning sighed and said the confusion in everyone's heart. Fang Yuan looked up at him. His eyes were dim and he didn't speak. The Enmore cult is the culprit who killed my junior sister apprentice. Su Li can't be willing to marry into the Ling family. Now it's just a temporary measure. What are you worried about? Wen Tingshan snorted. Although he had the shortest contact with Su Li, he was extremely confident in Su Li's temperament. Ling Li is the hierarch of the Enmore cult. Now Su Li is risking her life to marry him. We are also worried. We don't know when we can see her again, Fang Mu said faintly. Yin Xuetong and Mai Ruohan were lost. As women, they could understand Su Li better. At this moment, Su Li must be very uncomfortable. But she couldn't tell Dong Fang Rui all this. She could only bear it by herself. What are you talking about? Why are you so noisy? Suddenly, the door of the adytum was opened. A figure in white appeared in front of everyone without warning. Everyone was stunned. Su Li. Su Li. Fang Yuan trembled slightly and looked back incredulously. It was only the first morning of the wedding. Su Li came to the Linli building openly. Why? You seem to be very surprised. Su Li sat down expressionlessly and poured herself a cup of tea. She said indifferently, it's just a temporary measure to marry into the Ling family. There is no possibility between me and Ling Li. This time, I just used him. That, Yin Xuetong stammered and looked at Su Li's lower body. Her face was red. What she meant couldn't be more obvious. Su Li's reaction was very calm. She just shook her head slightly and said, it's just cooperation. How can I consummate with him? Hearing this, Chu Qingning and others couldn't help but cough. Although Su Li was open-minded and didn't care about it, they couldn't help but feel embarrassed when they heard such explicit words. Fang Yuan secretly breathed a sigh of relief. But then he felt that the situation was more serious. Although Su Li took advantage of Ling Li's love for her to hide in the Ling mansion, if it went on like this, it was hard to guarantee that they wouldn't. He knew very well that Su Li liked Ling Li very much. If it weren't for that thing, she would have loved Ling Li. Thinking of this, he took a breath and changed the topic. What should we do next? Su Li slightly raised her eyebrows and knocked on the table with her knuckles. She glanced at Wen Tingshan, who was silent, and said, the top priority is to clear up the worries. How is the investigation of the Wanjian sect going? Yin Xuetong shook her head and said disappointedly, we have cooperated with the Enmore cult, but we still can't find any clues of the Wanjian sect. The people of the Wanjian sect probably left. Really? Su Li didn't say yes or no. A glimmer of light flashed in her eyes. They are not under the protection of the royal family and can avoid the investigation of me and the Enmore cult. If they are still in Yunjing City, there is only one place left. Where else can they go? Chu Qingning frowned. He didn't know where the people of the Wanjian sect could hide. But when Tingshan's face suddenly changed at this moment, you mean, Su Li smiled coldly, the spiritual realm. When did the spiritual realm, which has always been indifferent to worldly affairs, intervene in the disputes of the sect? Uncle Shan, it seems that the group of people chasing you is more complicated than I thought. Chapter 272. When Tingshan glanced at the confused people, but he didn't mean to explain immediately. Instead, he thought for a moment and said, Su Li, the situation may not be as serious as you think. The spiritual realm has never cared about the affairs of the world. It doesn't care about the life and death of the forces in the spiritual circle. When Tinghe's people probably stayed in the spiritual realm by special means. What do you mean? Su Li had a vague guess in her heart, but she still asked. When Tingshan couldn't help standing up and said, let's go there immediately and tell you the details on the way. I'll go too. Fang Yuan stood up and stared at Su Li with a pair of black eyes firmly. Su Li's eyes flashed, and she suddenly had an idea. She immediately swallowed her refusal and nodded. Well, let's go now. All three of them were seniors. It was the fastest way to go there, but Su Li needed to save her foundation, so she chose to use a carriage instead of walking. Although when Tingshan didn't know Su Li's intention, he agreed and explained the reason on the way. When Tinghe is my younger brother. Although we are close relatives, He is indifferent and narrow-minded. His martial arts realm is naturally lower than mine. Not only him, but all the martial artists in the 10,000 Swords Pavilion who are still active should respect me. Fang Yuan was shocked by Wen Tingshan's first sentence. Wen Tingshan was the only senior in the longevity realm in the Linli building. Although he knew he was powerful, he didn't expect that he was the first senior in the Wanjian sect. Su Li nodded expressionlessly and said, "Go on." She was not surprised that Wen Tingshan was the first senior in the spiritual circle in the previous life. Wen Tingshan looked at Su Li with a little surprise. Although he felt strange, it was not the time to care about these details. He recalled what happened in these years and continued to tell with a gloomy expression. Although the token of the head of the Wanjian sect was lost, his strength was there. No one objected to my proposal to be the next head of the Wanjian sect. Perhaps my younger brother noticed that I still had a trace of affection for him in my heart, so he did not hesitate to use it to hurt me. Wen Tingshan smiled slightly, but his expression was bleak. That night, he colluded with outsiders and gathered more than 40 seniors in the first step of the longevity realm to kill me. If I hadn't broken through from the peak of the first step to the second step of the longevity realm at the critical moment, it would have been impossible for me to escape. Surrounded by 40 immortal levels. What kind of terrifying scene was that? In the entire martial arts circle of the Dahan country, there was no one in the longevity realm. Fang Yuan was shocked. Even Su Li's expression changed subtly. What she had seen and heard in her previous life was too low. She had only come into contact with immortal level when she was following the legendary lady. However, she had no idea about the division of immortal level. It was not a good time to ask about it. That night, I ran for my life in panic, and I ran for several years. My injuries didn't get better, and instead, they were getting worse. Because of this, I couldn't exert 10% of my strength. This situation lasted for a long time until I met you, Su Li. Although the star source of wood you have mastered is very little, it is more than enough to treat the people in the longevity realm. For the past half a year, you've personally treated my injuries. Coupled with the miraculous elixirs, the injuries on my body have long been healed, and my cultivation has also improved slightly. Su Li raised her eyebrows slightly. The star source of wood was the starlight mentioned by Qi Xianqing. It was a power that could only be mastered by the people in the longevity realm. I'm afraid that Wen Tinghe never dreamed that there would be a warrior of the inborn realm who mastered the holy means of healing in the secular world. Wen Tingshan sneered, "There are only 6 people in the first step of the longevity realm who chased me. With my current strength, it's easy to kill them. You have been staying in the Linli building all the time. Even if you fight, you hide your identity. They shouldn't know it. Why do you hide in the spiritual realm?" Hearing this, Su Li's speculation gradually became clear, and she asked directly. Wen Tingshan shook his head and smiled bitterly. Although our Wanjian sect specializes in swordsmanship, there are also practitioners who practice unorthodox methods. Wen Tinghe has a senior in the longevity realm who specializes in deduction. Relying on this person's deduction skill, they can follow me like maggots in a tarsal bone. I can't get rid of them no matter how hard I try. So, after your injury was healed, that person sensed the danger and hid in the spiritual realm with others. Su Li suddenly realized that everything was caused by the peeping sky skill. The sky-peering technique was a unique technique of the cultivators of the longevity realm who practiced the way of deduction. It could be used to predict good fortune and avoid disasters. It could also be used to track anything with the owner's breath. It had a wider range than the poisonous insect technique. For example, Fang Yuan's vital insect, the poisonous insect 1,000 miles tracking, could only cover a distance of 10,000 miles. But the tracking skill of the practitioners in the longevity realm could reach a distance of 100,000 miles or even 1,000,000 miles. The range would gradually expand with the growth of the practitioner's cultivation. Since you have reached the second step of cultivation and recovered, those people should know that their fate has long been doomed. Escaping into the spiritual realm is just deceiving themselves. Su Li curled her lips slightly. She knew very well what the spiritual realm was. Even with the peeping sky skill, she couldn't find any mystery. The practitioner who was proficient in the peeping sky skill must have regarded the spiritual realm as the only way to survive, so he hid in it with others. But he didn't know that the people in the spiritual realm would not care about them at all. After this trip, the matter in the Wanjian sect will be finished. Uncle Shan, I'm afraid you need to go back to the spiritual circle. Su Li said calmly. Wen Tingshan raised his eyebrows slightly and smiled. After I settle the chaos in the Wanjian sect, I will bring people back to help you. It won't take too long. With his cultivation, as long as he returned to the sect with the token, he could immediately grasp the general trend. At most, he could integrate the Wanjian sect within a month. Then I congratulate you in advance. Ho ho, Fang Yuan sat aside and watched them talking happily. He couldn't help but fall into silence. He found that he couldn't get a word in. He knew nothing about the so-called longevity realm, the peeping sky skill and the spiritual realm. Compared with Su Li, his knowledge was too far behind. For a time, a feeling of inferiority suddenly brewed in the bottom of his heart. This inferiority had existed for a long time, but it had been affecting him in a subtle way. At this moment, it was obvious that this inferiority had grown. However, even if he felt inferior, he would never retreat in front of Su Li. He would have his own way to make up for all the gaps. After an hour, the carriage finally stopped in front of a dilapidated temple. Fang Yuan got off the carriage and looked around. He couldn't help but feel puzzled. This place was infinitely close to the city wall of Yunjing City. It was a rare desolate place in Yunjing City. This temple. If he was right, it was a temple of the earth where no one worshipped for a long time. Was the spiritual realm here? Su Li walked slowly out of the carriage and looked solemn. Although she said it casually on the carriage, she didn't dare to be careless. If Fang Yuan observed more carefully, he would find that every grass, every tree, and even the gravel here contained a unique charm. It was otherworldly and did not belong to the world. It was like a small boat anchored at a dock that only had a tiny connection with the land. If this connection was broken, the existence here would immediately be like a small boat on a turbulent river, drifting away involuntarily. Su Li stood silently for a moment and recalled the scene when she met the extraordinary woman here for the first time in the previous life. But just for a moment, she came to her senses. In Fang Yuan's puzzled eyes, she nodded to Wen Tingshan and said, "Let's start." Wen Tingshan's eyes flashed. It seemed that he confirmed something at this moment. Then he did not hesitate to kneel in front of the statue of the Earth God. His height was exactly 99 feet. He patted his chest and forced out a drop of purple-red blood. He shouted, "Blood of the true spirit, open the true spirit." Just at the moment when his voice fell, there was a ripple in the originally calm nothingness like throwing a stone into the lake. The purple-red blood trembled and the ripple became bigger and bigger. Finally, everything in front of him was disturbed. The nothingness was torn apart like a piece of broken paper. Instead, there was another picture. Fang Yuan stared at the surroundings blankly. At this moment, he was not in a dilapidated temple, but a hall with extremely gorgeous and exquisite decoration. At this moment, there were only 3 of them in the hall. Such a magical scene completely subverted his view of the world. Su Li's reaction was average. The spiritual realm needed to be opened with the blood of the people of the spiritual circle. Although she was not a person of the spiritual circle, she had seen this scene countless times. When Tingshan saw Su Li's reaction and frowned slightly. He could not see whether Su Li was really calm or pretending. At this moment, a graceful voice came. Su Li and the other 2 looked at the same time. They saw a woman in cyan coming slowly. She gave a salute and said with a warm smile, "It turns out that you are the head of the Wanjian sect. Please forgive me for not going out to meet you." She seemed to be very respectful, but Fang Yuan still felt the indifference and coldness from her. It seemed that everything that happened in the world had nothing to do with them. They were more like bystanders than living in this world. "Fairy Qinghe, nice to meet you." When Tingshan returned a salute and said in a neither humble nor arrogant manner. He only had 2 impressions of the spiritual realm, mysterious and powerful, but he didn't dare to speak with contempt like Su Li. "I think we can't hide the purpose of our coming from Fairy Qinghe. Please don't interfere in the affairs of the Wanjian sect." Qinghe nodded with a smile and said, "Head, you must be joking. The spiritual realm never interferes in the affairs of the spiritual circle. It only records the rise and fall of the spiritual circle. The spiritual realm will not interfere in the affairs of the Wanjian sect. Please go ahead, head." Hearing this, Wen Tingshan's face darkened slightly, but he didn't dare to lose his temper. He could only take Su Li and Fang Yuan to look for the people of the Wanjian sect in the huge spiritual realm. But they didn't find anyone except Qinghe, not to mention that they recognized them. Chapter 273. Deacon Qinghe, what do you mean? After the group of people turned around and returned to the original hall, when Tingshan finally asked coldly. He had been to the spiritual realm before. In every country in the secular world and every big sect in the martial arts circle, there would be a spiritual realm stationed. In addition to the head of the realm, there were 6 deacons and many servants with lower status. But now, there was only one deacon in the spiritual realm of Dahan country, Qinghe, and there were no other servants. Was it normal? When Qinghe was questioned, the smile on her face slowly disappeared. Her originally warm tone also quickly became cold. Pavilion Master Wen, I don't understand what you're saying. If you want to deal with your family's matters, I've already asked you to do as you please. Could it be that you still expect me to provide you with some help? When Tingshan looked serious and was about to refute, Su Li suddenly stood out and stopped him. Uncle Shan, it's useless to say more. There is a tactical matrix here, and we haven't really entered the spiritual realm yet. Tactical matrix? Fang Yuan immediately became nervous. He subconsciously put Su Li behind him and looked around vigilantly. A trace of surprise flashed through Qinghe's eyes, but she didn't panic. She slightly raised the corners of her mouth and chuckled. I didn't expect this little sister to be an expert. This tactical matrix is nothing in our spiritual realm, but not everyone can detect it. Su Li smiled slightly and ignored Qinghe. She turned to Fang Yuan and said, do as I say, and I will teach you to break the tactical matrix. Fang Yuan was stunned and nodded with a little strange. If Su Li wanted to command him to break the tactical matrix, she could transmit the sound. Why did she say it clearly? Wasn't it a slap in the face of Deacon Qinghe? Sure enough, Qinghe saw that Su Li not only ignored her but also wanted to break the tactical matrix. Her face immediately became gloomy, and her voice became sharp because of anger. What a boastful little girl. How dare you break the tactical matrix of the spiritual realm? I'd like to see what you can do. Su Li smiled slightly. Deacon Qing, you don't need to understand what I can do. But before I break the tactical matrix, please don't act rashly, so as to avoid some unpleasant misunderstandings. Misunderstandings? Qinghe looked angry. You are just a silly little girl. You don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. How dare he threaten the deacon of spiritual realm? I will discipline you for Wen Tingshan. Before Su Li finished her words, Qinghe had already attacked angrily. Su Li squinted her eyes slightly and didn't dodge. Bang! There was an explosion in the air, and even the surrounding scene rippled. Qinghe widened her almond-shaped eyes and looked at Wen Tingshan in disbelief. She screamed, Wen Tingshan, how dare you attack me? This was the spiritual realm, the most mysterious and powerful force in this world. Whether it was the inborn realm or the longevity realm, there was no difference in front of this behemoth. The last person who offended the spiritual realm had already died without leaving any bones. Wen Tingshan's face was very ugly. Of course, he knew the result of fighting in the spiritual realm. But Su Li didn't dodge just now. It was obvious that she wanted him to fight. Noisy. Su Li frowned and looked indifferent. She continued to instruct, Uncle Shan, restrain her first. Wait until I break the tactical matrix. Wen Tingshan was also forthright. Anyway, he had already started. In for a penny, in for a pound. He directly grabbed Qinghe's nape with one hand, making her unable to move. Wen Tingshan, you are crazy. Your juniors don't know the rules. Don't you know the rules of the spiritual realm? You're digging your own grave. No one can save you. Slap. A bright red palm print appeared on Qinghe's face. It was burning. Su Li slowly withdrew her palm and still looked indifferent. She said, "If you dare to say more, it will not be as simple as a slap." "Shut up." Qinghe's eyes were full of fear. She didn't expect that when Tingshan was so bold. With her cultivation of the inborn sixth hurdle, she was no match for Wen Tingshan. She couldn't even react. What's more, she didn't expect that such a 16 or 17-year-old girl could be so decisive and ruthless. She even dared to slap her. She could see that the girl was clearly a hothead. She didn't know why Wen Tingshan obeyed her orders. However, after being slapped, she completely calmed down. The hothead was afraid of the unreasonable, and the unreasonable was afraid of the desperate. In Qinghe's eyes, Su Li was desperate. She chose to retreat temporarily. When the tactical matrix was broken, she would return to the spiritual realm and all the crises would be resolved. At that time, she would make Su Li beg for death. Qinghe thought bitterly. Su Li noticed her gaze but didn't respond at all. She continued to command Fang Yuan to break the tactical matrix. "Su Li, are you sure?" Wen Tingshan couldn't help but transmit the sound. Although Su Li had always shown extraordinary maturity and wisdom, he couldn't think of a way to break the spiritual realm rashly. "Uncle Shan, don't be impatient. After breaking the tactical matrix, you will know the result." Seeing Su Li's confident look, Wen Tingshan was a little relieved. He chose to believe her after getting along with her during this time. However, this sentence was a one-sided statement to cover up panic in Qinghe's ears. A vicious smile flashed across her face. She was already thinking about how to deal with Su Li after getting out of trouble. 31 steps to the right, draw your sword. 9 steps forward, shatter the stone pillar. Return to the original position. Su Li's voice constantly came to his ears. Fang Yuan's expression remained unchanged and he executed meticulously. In his opinion, the difficulty of breaking this tactical matrix was even less than that of the natural tactical matrix they encountered in the mountains of Dorwang village. In less than 10 minutes, the surrounding scene made a sound like porcelain breaking. With the last sword of Fang Yuan, the tactical matrix was broken. After the fluctuation of the tactical matrix passed, the 4 figures appeared in front of an exquisitely decorated hexagonal attic. The plaque spiritual realm on the attic was shining. The sudden appearance of the 3 people naturally attracted the attention of people in the attic. When someone saw Qinghe being controlled by Wen Tingshan with a pale face, everyone's face suddenly changed. Even the attic itself was faintly shaking. It had not happened for many years that outsiders caught the executive of the spiritual realm. "Go and inform the head of the spiritual realm. They have bad intentions. Isn't that the next head of the Wanjian sect? Why does he suddenly attack Lady Qinghe? Something big is going to happen today." Wen Tingshan looked at the chaos of the spiritual realm because of their appearance calmly, but he couldn't help but frown slightly. Qinghe saw this scene and finally laughed out loud. "Wen Tingshan, if you still have a shred of reason left in you, let go of me now and push all the blame onto this girl. Perhaps if I'm in a good mood, I might even let you live. Otherwise, all of you will die." Wen Tingshan's face was gloomy and his eyes changed. But his hands were always clenched tightly without any relaxation. Qinghe didn't understand the relationship between him and Su Li at all. He owed Su Li his life and promised to work for her for 10 years. Even if it was a dangerous situation, he would not choose to give up Su Li and escape alone. Moreover, he was not completely without confidence in Su Li. As for Fang Yuan, who stood beside Su Li, he was always expressionless. No matter what happened, he would completely stand on Su Li's side and would not waver. Not long after, the other 5 executives stationed here all arrived and stood in a line to confront Su Li and the other 3. Soon after, a middle-aged man in a grey robe with a plain face stepped out of the attic. He slightly cupped his hands to Wen Tingshan and said in a neither humble nor arrogant manner, "Head Wen, I've heard a lot about you. You are also a giant in the spiritual circle. How did our deacon Qing offend you? Why did you come to the spiritual realm for confrontation?" Seeing the middle-aged man's gentle attitude, Wen Tingshan frowned a little and hesitated. "Your Excellency, are you?" The middle-aged man seemed to understand and nodded with a smile. "I forgot that I am Chu Xiao, the head of the spiritual realm of Dahan country. Head Chu. Before Wen Tingshan spoke, Su Li stepped out and said with a faint smile. This. Chu Xiao frowned slightly and felt uncomfortable. He saw that Su Li was only about 16 years old. She didn't know the etiquette. The discipline of the Wanjian sect was too loose. Su Li smiled calmly and didn't give the middle-aged man a chance to speak. It doesn't matter who I am. The important thing is that Head Chu, you are incompetent and let the spiritual realm produce such an unruly executive. What should you do? What? Chu Xiao's expression turned cold. He looked at the pitiful Qing He with a questioning look in his eyes. When Qing He met his gaze, she panicked and immediately cried out, "Building master, save me. I didn't overstep the rules." This girl didn't know the rules at all. She not only let Wen Tingshan catch me but also slapped me. She didn't take the spiritual realm seriously at all. As soon as the words came out, the other 5 executives were immediately furious and spoke one after another. Head, you can't be careless. Otherwise, you will lose the face of the spiritual realm. How dare you offend the spiritual realm at such a young age? How did your elders teach you? I think it's better to catch Wen Tingshan and others together and deal with them severely. Even if the Wanjian sect holds us responsible, we have something to say. Be quiet. Chu Xiao's voice was not loud, but it overshadowed everyone. The scene immediately became silent. As the head of the spiritual realm, his ability naturally surpassed all the executives. In the face of Qing He's cry for help, he thought of another unusual detail at the moment. It seemed that this girl was not Wen Tingshan's elder, but Wen Tingshan followed her orders. And, little girl, you mentioned the rules of the spiritual realm. With a faint smile on his face, Chu Xiao fixed his eyes on Su Li's beautiful face. The rules of the spiritual realm are never spread out. Do you really know what rules we follow? Hearing this, Su Li couldn't help but chuckle. Her lips moved slightly, and her voice was transmitted to the latter's ears. Chapter 274. Come on, take Qing He away. Chu Xiao's expression was no longer gentle, and his decision was even more shocking. The other 5 deacons widened their eyes and felt cold all over. They couldn't help but look at Su Li again. What on earth did the woman say to the head? She could make the head punish Qing He in public regardless of the face of the spiritual realm. Qing He's face was pale and she was completely panicked. She couldn't stop struggling and screaming, "Lord, what did I do wrong? I have served the spiritual realm for 32 years. Even if I don't have any credit, I have worked hard. Could it be that my years of conscientious service are nothing more than a few words of a silly girl? My lord, you've disappointed this concubine too much." The touching words and Qing He's innocent and unwilling look made everyone in the spiritual realm feel a little strange. Today's decision of the head was too unfair. Seeing this, Chu Xiao snorted and said clearly, "Bai Ju, find out the relationship between her and Wen Tinghe of the Wanjian sect. If she really violates the rules of the spiritual realm, she will be expelled from the spiritual realm." What? Qing He colluded with outsiders? The old man with grey hair turned pale with fright when he heard this. He was Bai Ju who Chu Xiao had mentioned, and he was also the number 1 deacon among the 6 deacons. The doubts in the eyes of the other 4 deacons faded away. They were all surprised and doubtful. Chu Xiao dared to say it clearly, so he must have some confidence. When Qing He heard this, she knew clearly what would happen to her. She trembled all over and collapsed on the ground like a puddle of mud. She took risks for temporary interests and thought that she would never be discovered. Now Chu Xiao was suspicious, and she couldn't stand the investigation at all. Chu Xiao saw Qing He's reaction, and the last hesitation in his eyes disappeared. He said with an ugly face, "I wanted to save you some face. Since you don't want it, don't blame me for being ruthless and taking her away." Bai Ju immediately took the order and walked to Wen Tingshan. Wen Tingshan glanced at Su Li and saw her nod. Then he let go of his hand and let Bai Ju take her into the spiritual realm. A conflict disappeared. After a while, Su Li and the other 2 were invited to the room. Wen Tingshan looked around and knew that the standard of this guest room was not simple. He became more and more curious about what Su Li said to Chu Xiao. He didn't think it was only because of Qinghe that Chu Xiao's attitude changed so much. When Ting Shan didn't have time to think about it, Chu Xiao came over with a smile. He cupped his hands and said, "Miss, this is indeed the problem of the spiritual realm. As an apology, I will capture the people from the 10,000 Swords Pavilion and hand them over to Pavilion Master Wen. In addition, the spiritual realm will also give you other compensation, which can be regarded as a comfort for you." "How long has it been?" "Master Chu has already found out the truth." When Tingshan was surprised. It was only less than 10 minutes. Even if he wanted to make Qinghe confess, it would not be so easy. Although when Tingshan interrupted, Chu Lu didn't show any anger on her face. She explained with a smile, "Don't be surprised, Pavilion Master Wen. The spiritual realm records the rise and fall of the spiritual circle and even this world. The intelligence system is extremely thorough. Now, except for the mistake of Deacon Qinghe, it is not because of the problem of intelligence, but because no one checked it. Now that Deacon Qinghe is pointed out by this miss, it is easy for the spiritual realm to check it." Wen Tingshan nodded slightly and understood, but he was shocked in his heart. In this way, nothing in the world could be hidden from the eyes and ears of the spiritual realm. If the spiritual realm had been ambitious and never participated in the disputes of the outside world, the overlord of the spiritual circle would not have been the turn of those forces. It seems that Pavilion Master Wen is satisfied with my handling. In this case, Chu Xiao turned his eyes to Su Li and changed the topic. "Miss, can I have a word with you?" Su Li's eyes flashed and she nodded. "That's what I mean. Uncle Shan, Fang Yuan, I will be back soon. You wait here for a moment. Miss, don't worry. During this time, the spiritual realm will entertain you well." Chu Xiao said considerately, and there seemed to be some eagerness in his words. Although when Tingshan and Fang Yuan had a lot of doubts in their hearts, they also knew that it was not the time to ask, so they immediately nodded and agreed. A moment later, on the top floor of the spiritual realm, Su Li calmly followed Chu Xiao in. If Fang Yuan was qualified to come here, he would find that the layout here was similar to that of the attic on the top floor of the Linli building. The only difference was that the cost of the furniture here was more than 10 million times more expensive than that of the attic of the Linli building. When they met alone, Chu Xiao finally showed his true feelings. He didn't look at Su Li as an elder looked at a junior, but as an equal. "May I ask which branch of the spiritual realm you are? Why did you leave your post and come to our Dahan country as a guest?" After a moment of silence, Chu Xiao probed cautiously. Just now, Su Li didn't say much in sound transmission, just 2 words. Jing Xin. Only people above the level of the head of the spiritual realm were qualified to know this name. Su Li smiled as if she returned to her own home. She walked to the table and sat down calmly. "Head Chu, you don't need to test me. I'm not a head of any spiritual realm, let alone a member of the spiritual realm." Chu Xiao's expression changed immediately. How could the name of the great master be leaked? Was there a traitor among the heads of the spiritual realm? But at this moment, Su Li spoke again. "Head Chu, you don't need to guess blindly. I'm not an enemy of the spiritual realm. I just had a relationship with that person a long time ago. If it's convenient, please transmit the sound in silence to her and tell her that an old friend invited me. I think she should understand." Chu Xiao was shocked. An old friend? The great master was so ancient and had lived for so many years. But today, a 16-year-old girl said that she was an old friend of the great master. He immediately thought of some legendary existences. It was said that even if those existences died, they could escape the restraint of the natural law and get a glimpse of the mystery of heaven and reincarnate with memory. Was it possible that the person standing in front of him was a reincarnated Supreme Master? Thinking of this, Chu Xiao's heart beat like a drum and his expression became extremely respectful. He bent down and whispered, "What you said, I dare not disobey. But, may I have the honor to know your name, so that I can have proof when I report?" "Su Li, Su as in Gusu and Li as in Linli." Su Li responded a little weirdly. She just suspected that Jingxin knew her previous life and present life, but she didn't know how many bizarre things Chu Xiao had imagined. Jing Xin. It was a strange name. It was the name that she told herself when she followed that amazing woman in her previous life. Later, she left Jing Xin and traveled in the martial world. She didn't know how important this name was until she got the chance to do so. The spiritual realm was a terrifying force beyond the mortal world, and Jing Xin was its master. People called Great Lord of True Spirit. In the previous life, she was in a miserable situation. When she met Jing Xin, she had already fallen into the evil circle and was hated by everyone. The so-called righteous people all wanted to kill her. At that time, Jing Xin came forward to protect her and allowed her to practice with her for 3 years. Those 3 years greatly enriched her knowledge. Without those 3 years, she was afraid that she would have died early. However, that encounter also left her with many questions. She couldn't figure out why an ordinary girl like her, who had only stepped onto the path of cultivation by chance, had even gone astray. She didn't have the slightest bit of difference, so why exactly was she able to enter the eyes of the Holy Lord? Moreover, the evaluation of the Great Lord of True Spirit in the spiritual circle was positive, while she, an evil witch, was even more unreasonable. After her rebirth, she had always suppressed all kinds of doubts in her heart. Until the so-called broken ring appeared, all kinds of incredible things made her have a moment of enlightenment. Perhaps Jing Xin had already seen her future. Perhaps there were some things she wanted to know from Jing Xin. On the one hand, she came to the spiritual realm to denounce the Wanjian sect, but more for the purpose in her heart. The matter of Wen Tinghe was just solved by the way. It was one of the iron rules of the spiritual realm not to have cause and effect with the spiritual circle. If Qing He dared to use her power for personal gain, she would end up worse than she imagined. She vaguely remembered that in the previous life, there was a greedy head of a branch of the spiritual realm and became a local tyrant. Later, he was beheaded by Jing Xin in public. His head was hung in the Zong Pavilion of the spiritual realm for 7 days and 7 nights, which made people tremble. However, many years after that incident, she changed many futures in this life. After Qing He was caught, it was still unknown whether there would be such a local tyrant again. After thinking for a moment, the chaotic thoughts faded in her mind. Su Li came back to herself and saw Chu Xiao standing aside and waiting quietly. She couldn't help but feel a little ridiculous, but she didn't explain anything and walked out of the attic. Chu Xiao immediately followed her and whispered in Su Li's ear, "Senior, you have thought for an hour. I have handed the traitor of the Wanjian sect to Wen Tingshan to deal with. If you need." Before Chu Xiao finished his words, Su Li's eyes became cold and she asserted, "The spiritual realm is not contaminated with cause and effect. If you dare to violate it, no one can save you." Chu Xiao suddenly woke up and cold sweat immediately flowed down. "Senior, you are right. I am confused." Su Li shook her head and was about to leave. Before she left, she didn't forget to say, "If you have no other important things, it is better to let your great lord know about my affairs as soon as possible. I will go to the Zong Pavilion today." Chu Xiao repeatedly promised and sent Su Li to the door. Then he left in a hurry, which made other deacons' eyes wide open. They secretly guessed what noble identity Su Li had and even wanted to explore it. However, this idea was interrupted by Chu Xiao's warning before it was implemented. No one dared to think about it anymore. When the 3 returned to the Linli building, it had been half a day. When Tingshan was full of bloody smell. Obviously, he had just killed someone. He didn't talk too much with Su Li and left directly. He needed to go back to the Wanjian sect to deal with the funeral affairs. With the deterrence of the spiritual realm and the token of the head, it was easy for him to succeed as the head. Chapter 275. Because of the marriage, Su Li failed to deal with the intelligence gathered from all directions for 2 days. She stayed in the attic until the evening. Then she left without stopping. Chu Qingning saw this scene and couldn't help but sigh. Su Li didn't seem to change much before and after the marriage, but he couldn't tell what was different. "Why are you sighing?" A figure suddenly appeared behind him. Chu Qingning was so scared that he almost jumped up. When he saw Luo Yichen, he immediately said angrily, "Can't you make a sound when you walk? You will be scared to death. I haven't seen a warrior of the inborn realm be scared to death. You might as well broaden my horizons. Luo Ichen smiled. In the Linli building, Chu Qingning had the best relationship with him except my Ruohan. Otherwise, he wouldn't even tell a cold joke according to his temper. Well, your temper. I don't want to talk to you. Fang Yuan wants to talk to us. He is in the Aditum now. Let's go. Chu Qingning suddenly understood. No wonder Luo Ichen, who was obsessed with martial arts, had time to talk to him. It turned out that he wanted to talk to him. But Su Li just left. What could Fang Yuan have to talk to him? With doubts, Chu Qingning followed Luo Ichen to the underground Aditum. All the acquaintances were sitting at the table. Compared with the secret discussion in the morning, only when Tingshan and Su Li were absent. Everyone is here. Seeing Chu Qingning and Fang Yuan arrive, Yin Xuetong's eyes flashed. Brother Fang, what do you want to talk to us about? Fang Yuan glanced at everyone and said softly, I just have a little doubt and need to verify. How many Wudao stones did Su Li give you? As he said, he spread out his palm, and there were 9 Wudao stones on it. Hiss, Chu Qingning took a breath and screamed, I thought Su Li had given me enough Wudao stones. You have 1 more than me. I have 8. Fang Mu met his eldest brother's eyes and immediately said obediently, I also have 8. A light flashed in Luo Ichen's eyes. He seemed to notice the strangeness and said softly, 9. Yin Xuetong frowned, I also have 8. Su Li asked me to practice hard and break through the inborn realm as soon as possible. My Ruohan and Fang Ling looked at each other and took out 4 martial arts stones each. Their cultivation time was too short, so no matter how many martial arts stones they had, it was useless. Seeing the number of Wudao stones in everyone's hands, Fang Yuan's expression sank completely. Luo Ichen thought for a while and murmured, Fang Yuan, I remember you said that Su Li disguised as Mr. Li to meet Ling Li and asked for 50 Wudao stones. Now, the martial arts stones are all here. Yin Xuetong's eyes flashed with shock and puzzlement. Su Li didn't even keep one for herself. Doesn't she need to practice? In an instant, a heavy feeling lingered in everyone's heart. Before Su Li was about to die, she made arrangements for her funeral. Now she inexplicably survived and did such a strange thing. People couldn't help but associate the two with each other. Sure. Fang Yuan was silent. He grabbed the Wudao stones and stood up suddenly. Then he turned around and left. Chu Qingning was shocked. Fang Yuan, don't be impulsive. What are you going to do? Fang Yuan stopped and looked back at Chu Qingning coldly. Chu Qingning felt cold all over. Then he said softly, practice. His strength couldn't help her. Only by mastering enough cultivation as soon as possible could he be qualified to reverse the situation. He didn't want to experience the powerlessness of the last time again. Cultivation couldn't be done behind closed doors. He needed to improve his cultivation in a more crazy way. Hey, wait for me. Chu Qingning was worried and hurriedly chased after him. After a long time, he came back alone and was a little lost. Qingning, Yin Xuetong greeted him with concern. Chu Qingning smiled reluctantly and said, I'm fine. Fang Yuan said that he went to Uncle Shan's place to practice and strive to break through his cultivation as soon as possible. I just think whether we should do something. We can't let Su Li handle everything alone, can we? Yin Xuetong was stunned, and then a touch of relief appeared in her eyes. They were all young, less than 20 years old. In ordinary families, they were still ignorant children. Chu Qingning was carefree and cynical. If there was no accident, the man in her eyes might need a few years or even a decade to understand what responsibility was. However, under the stimulation of Su Li and Fang Yuan, he was maturing at a very fast speed. Qingning, do what you want to do. I will support you wholeheartedly and won't hold you back. Yin Xuetong's gentle voice came. Chu Qingning was stunned and immediately grinned. Wait for me to call Luo Ichen. I can't let you stay in the room alone. Yin Xuetong blushed slightly and couldn't help but spit. Don't be serious. Hurry up. Now there is nothing to do in the Linli building, and Uncle Shan will bring people back soon. You can leave at ease. Okay. Chu Qingning solemnly responded, and his eyes flashed with firmness. Su Li kept saying that it was a fair deal. But now Su Li's unilateral contribution couldn't be completely covered by a deal. No matter how much time she had left, they would try their best to break through their own realms and do their best to help her. Only in this way could they have no regrets in their hearts. In the east courtyard of the Ling mansion, Ling Qinglan came back from the Supreme Judiciary and was discussing recent important things with Ling Li. His sister Yi Shui came back, which made him happy recently. Even if the cases of the Supreme Judiciary and the Tianya House were piled up and he was extremely tired every day, he was not unhappy at all. Recently, the Nanjiang country and the Lianxia cult fought fiercely, and even the border suffered. The army is ready to take action. I'm afraid that the second brother will go to battle again. Ling Qinglan analyzed. Ling Li frowned slightly. The war of the Nanjiang country had subsided. However, at the auction at the end of the year, he plotted to kill Wei Yuran and successfully framed the Lianxia cult. But it also caused the second brother to return to the battlefield. The situation on the battlefield changed rapidly. Over the years, he couldn't arrive in time every time to help Ling Ping win the battle. Now the relationship between him and the royal family was getting more and more tense. In this case, how could he not worry about Ling Ping going to battle again? But at this moment, the mechanism on the table suddenly turned on its own, and a hole appeared on the ground. Su Li's voice slowly emerged from the ground. Ling Qinglan was slightly shocked, and then he was relieved. Whether Su Li wanted to marry Ling Li or not, she was indeed the wife of the hierarch of the Enmore cult. Of course, she was qualified to use the tunnel of the headquarter. Seeing that Ling Qinglan was also there, Su Li's eyes flickered slightly. I'll leave now. No. Ling Li interrupted. He didn't ask where Su Li went today. He stared at Su Li for a moment and said slowly, if I am in the study and you are in the wing room, how will my mother and others think of it? Ling Qinglan, who was watching, couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. He sighed a little. Sure enough, Su Li was forced to marry into the Ling family. She and Ling Li were so close at the beginning. Whoever thought that their relationship was so estranged? Since Hierarch Ling is not afraid that the information of your cult will be leaked, Su Li said coldly. She walked to the rattan chair next to the bookshelf and sat down. She picked up an ancient book and read it quietly. She knew that it was nothing more than an excuse for Ling Li to let her stay with him. But she couldn't refute this excuse. After all, no one knew whether Chiu Meng was observing her. Ling Li saw that Su Li promised to stay, but she even sat with her back to him. Helplessness flashed in his eyes. This kind of marriage also made Su Li hate him completely. Her words and deeds made him feel very uncomfortable. But even so, he still wanted Su Li to stay with him. It was painful and happy. Ling Qinglan pursed his lips and continued to talk about other information. The relationship between Su Li and Ling Li was complicated. He didn't want to get involved. It was getting dark. Ling Mo came forward to light the oil lamp, and then continued to guard the door. Occasionally, he curiously stretched out his head to see what Su Li was reading. Su Li didn't mean to hide and let Ling Mo peep. Ling Mo, you don't need to guard here. Go to practice first. Suddenly, Ling Li's voice came. Ling Mo was slightly stunned. It was almost time for dinner, and Ling Qinglan was not here. Madam might come to check in person. Was the master confused to let him practice at this time? There was a clear sound of turning pages. Ling Mo suddenly understood. Then he felt strange and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Just because Su Li asked him to peep at the books, the master was jealous? How could he be jealous? The relationship between him and Su Li was obviously terrible. In this case, the master could be so stingy. It was rare in the world. Ling Mo. When Ling Li spoke again with a black face, Su Li suddenly closed the book and stood up. She picked up the teapot on the stove and made a cup of tea. Then she carefully brought it to Ling Li, who was full of astonishment. Her face became as gentle as water in an instant. A touch of bright red appeared on her face. She whispered, "Honey, please have some tea." Then, she helped Su Li to clean up the files. In the blink of an eye, the files on the table were cleared. Ling Li was immediately stunned and couldn't understand. At the moment when Su Li finished cleaning up, Ling Mo's expression changed slightly. He immediately opened the door and went out. Then Ling Li heard the voice, "Madam." Chiu Meng came. He should have thought of it. But he was shocked by Su Li's action and was distracted for a while. However, because of the tactical matrix of the East Courtyard, ordinary inborn spiritual awareness could not penetrate it. Even Ling Mo, who specially spent a lot of effort to practice the psychic awareness, just noticed the arrival of Chiu Meng. How did Su Li know the whereabouts of his mother in advance? Was it possible that Su Li's psychic awareness was stronger than Ling Mo's? Just when Ling Li was in doubt, Chiu Meng had already pushed the door open and came in. She saw Su Li standing quietly beside her son and glimpsed the fragrant tea. Her smile on her face immediately became wider. Originally, she was worried that Su Li pretended to be virtuous in front of her. After all, with her son's ability, if he was really arrogant in front of her daughter-in-law, it would be hard for Su Li not to dislike him. Fortunately, all her worries were superfluous. Su Li was much more sensible than she thought. Chapter 276. At dinner, Ms. Jiyu might be tired, so she didn't show up. After Ling Li had dinner with Su Li and his mother, Chiu Meng handed an invitation to Ling Li and said carefully, "Son, I know that you have turned over a new leaf for Li and no longer go out to make trouble. But it's not a good idea to stay at home. I have an invitation here. Take Li to the banquet. Don't let her be wronged. Do you understand?" Ling Li nodded helplessly and listened to his mother's advice casually. He opened the invitation and glanced at it. Suddenly, he was shocked. Chiu Meng noticed that something was wrong and couldn't help but ask, "Son, what's wrong with the invitation?" "No, no." Ling Li responded quickly and said with a smile, "But mother, you know that I seem to have a relationship with the host of the banquet." Then, he raised the invitation in his hand. Su Li vaguely saw the words Dongfang Yuan flashed on it, and an unknown meaning flashed on her face. Hearing that, Chiu Meng's face immediately darkened. She glanced at Su Li quietly and saw that Su Li was confused. She secretly breathed a sigh of relief and scolded in a low voice, "You have a family now. You can't do the ridiculous thing in the past again." Fortunately, the fourth princess is also married. She won't care about the past. You can take Su Li to the banquet. Don't care about the past. Ling Li smiled bitterly. He didn't believe it, but he didn't refuse. He agreed with a bitter face. Seeing that her son nodded, Chiu Meng left with satisfaction. She thought that she could finally hold her head high in front of those gossipy women. As for how to deal with the banquet tomorrow, it would be solved by the juniors themselves. The bowls and chopsticks were cleaned up by the servants. Ling Li took the invitation and returned to the East Courtyard with Su Li. He looked calm and a hint of wisdom flashed in his eyes. The host of the banquet was the fourth princess, Dongfang Yuan. Su Li gently picked up the invitation that Ling Li put on the table. She opened it and said in a quiet and sweet voice, "The fourth princess invites all the couples in Yunjing City who have been married for less than a year. Although the reason is sufficient, the time is coincidentally the second day after our marriage." Speaking of this, Su Li looked slightly cold and smiled in a low voice, "Dongfang Xiao is really suspicious." Ling Li nodded in agreement. The so-called purpose of the banquet was not as simple as his mother thought. It was obviously a test arranged by Dongfang Xiao. "By the way, what happened between you and Dongfang Yuan?" After a moment of silence in the room, Su Li suddenly asked. Ling Li held his breath, and a trace of embarrassment flashed on his face. He didn't say a word for a long time. Seeing this, Su Li's expression didn't change at all. She just shook her head and sneered, "Well, I'm not interested in your romantic history. Don't make any mistakes tomorrow." Then, Su Li stepped out of the study and quickly disappeared into the night. Ling Li stood at the table and looked out of the window at the dark night. After a long time, he took a breath and came back to himself. His eyes were clear again. Turning the wheelchair to the wing room, Ling Li didn't see Su Li. He couldn't help but wonder where Su Li could go at this time. At this time, Mammy Li passed by the room with a bucket of water. Seeing that the master seemed to be looking for something, she couldn't help but say, "Master, are you looking for Madam?" Madam is taking a bath in the back hall. If you go there now, you can catch up. Catch up with what? Ling Li was stunned. Seeing Mammy Li's meaningful smile, his face immediately turned red, and his face was so hot that it could almost make a sesame seed cake. Haha. Mammy Li couldn't help laughing. She quickly left with the bucket of water. The master was still too thin-skinned. It was not a big deal. Naturally, Ling Li couldn't go to the back hall. Otherwise, he could foresee that he would probably be kicked out by Su Li. It was not easy to maintain the current situation. He didn't want his image in Su Li's heart to continue to deteriorate. After going to the bathhouse on the other side to take a rough bath, Ling Li returned to the wing room and waited for a long time. Su Li came back slowly. Before he saw her, a wisp of fragrance had floated into his nose. The delicate and beautiful face showed a perfect outline in the moonlight. The white gauze dress was blown by the night wind, and the exposed white skin was still steaming. She was like a fairy from the ninth heaven, unstained by the secular world. It seemed that she would float away in the next moment. Such a smart and beautiful woman was his wife now. Ling Li thought of this, and he was fascinated for a moment. Suddenly, whoosh! A white shadow flashed in front of Ling Li's eyes very quickly, and closed the wooden doors on both sides of the inner room. Then he heard a clear sound of the door bolt. Ling Li woke up and was instantly dumbfounded. Su Li locked the door? Darling, no one will make trouble in the bridal chamber today. In the future, you can only have a rest in the guest room. Don't worry, it won't be too hard for a long time. When the crisis is over, you can divorce me. Su Li's voice came from the door. It seemed that she felt it was not very moral. Her tone was very soft, but Ling Li felt that there was a hint of schadenfreude in her voice. What a devil! Ling Li was angry. He was also a man, and facing his beloved woman, how could he have no reaction? But it was the most painful thing that he could see her but couldn't touch her. Nothing happened all night, and it was dawn in the blink of an eye. Squeak! The door made a light sound, and Su Li came out of the inner room. She was dressed neatly, with a ruddy face and full of spirit. It seemed that she had a good sleep. The sound woke up Ling Li, who tossed and turned for nearly a night and slept in his clothes in the morning. He fell off the rattan chair carelessly. Hiss! Ling Li took a light breath and looked at Su Li's faint smile. His face darkened. He had reached the inborn realm, and he wouldn't feel tired even if he didn't sleep for 3 days and 3 nights. But last night was too torturous, and the energy consumed was much more than that of 3 days and 3 nights. So, he felt a little tired now. At this moment, Mammy Li pushed the door and came in with things to wash. Seeing that they had gotten up early in the morning and seemed to be quarreling, she didn't say much. She just glanced at the messy bed with a slight meaning, and then turned to go out with a snicker. The maids in the wing room of the east courtyard were all arranged by Chiu Meng. In order not to expose Ling Li's action, Su Li had ordered servants to wash in the morning, and Mammy Li, who was an insider, was responsible for it. It saved a lot of trouble. Washing and tying up their hair ended in an awkward and harmonious weird atmosphere. After breakfast, they got on the carriage and left. Apparently, they only took Ling Mo and Yun Yi as guards. After the carriage with the mark of the Ling family passed through 2 streets, it drove into the controlled street that only the royal family was qualified to walk. It was unimpeded all the way, and finally stopped in a large royal courtyard. Master, madam, here we are. Ling Mo, who was driving the carriage, said. At the same time, Yun Yi opened the curtain, set up the skateboard, and waited for Su Li and Ling Li to get off the horse. Su Li pushed the wheelchair out of the carriage. Looking ahead, there was a high wall with red walls and green tiles. On the tall and spacious gate, there was a plaque with 3 flamboyant characters hanging. Lingfeng House. She looked relaxed, but there was a deep caution in her eyes. This was an important place of the royal family, and it was only 1 step away from the imperial palace. If her and Ling Li's real identity was exposed here, it would be hard to escape. In the early years, this was the residence of Dongfang Yuyan. Later, Dongfang Yuyan married a husband, and this place was expanded again. So, it has today's scale. The area of the courtyard for the banquet can accommodate hundreds of people at the same time. Ling Li transmitted the sound in silence in a low tone. Here, they couldn't allow any carelessness. Every step must be carefully analyzed. This trip could be regarded as dangerous. No one could predict whether Dongfang Xiao would suddenly attack them. Qiu Meng, who was simple, might not think of this. Otherwise, she would definitely not let Ling Li and Ling Li take risks even if she fell out with those noble madams. At this moment, a group of maids and eunuchs came out of the gatehouse. They saluted to Ling Li and Su Li and said, "Greetings, Your Highness." "Greetings, Your Highness." Ling Li was a little proud and shouted, "Madam, what are you looking at? It's almost time. Let's go in." Su Li's eyes flashed slightly. It seemed that she just came to herself. She blushed and said embarrassedly, "It's the first time for me to come to the royal courtyard. I make a fool of myself." "Hey, even if you make a fool of yourself, you are still very beautiful. It's really, beauty is delicious." Su Li blushed again. She quickly pushed Ling Li into the courtyard. The conversation was heard by the maids. Although they didn't dare to show anything on their faces, they secretly despised them. Even though they were poor in literature, they still knew beauty is delicious. How could the third child of the Ling family mispronounce it? The most talented girl in Yunjing City should marry such a vulgar playboy. It was a reckless waste. They didn't know what the emperor was thinking. The design of the Lingfeng house was obviously done by a master. The scenery of every step could be called a picture. It was just beautiful but not arrogant. Su Li could see that the princess, whom she had never met, was not scheming and not difficult to deal with. After pushing the wheelchair through the gravel path, the two of them suddenly saw the light. They also heard the lively conversation. At this moment, there were no less than 30 pairs of beauties and talents in the courtyard. Many people also noticed the arrival of Su Li and Ling Li. Seeing the couple famous in the capital in front of them, everyone had different reactions. But they all whispered at the same time. "She is Princess Li. She deserves her reputation. Her eyebrows, eyes, and red lips are just perfect. Her skin is as clear as cream. She deserves the title of the first beauty in Yunjing City. You can say this to me. Don't tell your wife. Otherwise, you can't blame me for the trouble in the backyard. Ha ha ha, it's a pity that such a pharaoh-like woman should marry a playboy. Playboy. He is clearly a good-for-nothing. It's flattering to call him a playboy." Ling Li's eyebrows twitched. With his hearing, he naturally heard every word. But he had to pretend that he didn't hear it. It was really aggrieved. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.